Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy, old stones get a fair hearing, and history is allowed to take its time without rushing to explain everything before the kettle has even boiled. Tonight, we are heading into the high green folds of Peru, to a place where the mountains seem to hold their breath, the clouds move slowly over the ridges, and one strange carved stone waits beside the ruins of a vanished Inca world. Its name is Yurac Rumi, often translated from Quechua as the White Rock, and it is one of those places that makes even a calm, sensible person stop for a moment and say, well now, that is not quite ordinary. Not because it proves anything wild, not because we need to leap immediately into lost civilizations, impossible machines, or visitors with suspiciously advanced stone polishing hobbies, but because Yurac Rumi has that rare quality that some ancient places have. It refuses to become simple. You can look at it as an archaeological site, a sacred shrine, a carved boulder, a ceremonial space, a remnant of Inca power in the mountains of Vilcabamba, and all of those descriptions are useful. And yet, when you stand before it, or even when you see a photograph of it, with its smooth plains, carved ledges, steps, hollows, channels, niches and shapes that seem to turn the rock into something halfway between architecture and sculpture, it still feels like the explanation has not quite caught up with the object. There it sits, not as a loose stone someone casually decorated on a quiet afternoon, but as a large natural outcrop that was worked into a place of purpose. Parts of it look deliberate in the way a temple wall looks deliberate. Other parts feel almost too strange to name. Some surfaces are cut into sharp forms, others slope and fold around the natural body of the stone. There are seats, or what look like seats. There are lines that might have guided water. There are carved spaces that suggest ritual, observation, authority, or maybe all three at once. And because the Inca did not leave us long written explanations in the way modern historians might wish, the stone does not come with a neat little label saying, this bit was for this corner was for that, and please stop inventing theories before breakfast. So tonight, we will not try to solve Yurac Rumi in a hurry. That would be rude to the rock, and probably inaccurate besides. Instead, we will approach it slowly, as one should approach a place in the Andes where stone, water, empire, memory and mystery have been sitting together for centuries. We will follow the path toward Vilcabamba, the remote region where the last Inca rulers resisted Spanish control after Cusco had fallen. We will think about the people who carved sacred meaning into living rock. We will look at why this stone appears so unusual, why it has inspired so many questions, and why the most interesting answer may not be that it doesn't make sense, but that it made sense within a world we no longer fully understand. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere near mountains or near the sea, or tucked away in a city where the oldest stones are hidden under pavements and apartment blocks? And is there an ancient place near you? A ruin, a church, a standing stone, an old wall, or even just a weathered corner of town that always makes you wonder who stood there before you? There is something comforting about remembering that every listener arrives here from a different landscape. Some of you may be hearing this in the morning with coffee, some may be listening late at night with the room quiet and the screen dim. Some may be very responsibly preparing for sleep, and others may be pretending that one more video is still part of the bedtime routine, which is a bold archaeological tradition of its own. And if you find this little journey soothing, curious, or just a pleasant way to let the day settle down, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of calm reach others who enjoy wandering through ancient places without being shouted at by dramatic drums every 15 seconds. There will be no urgent countdowns here, no claims that history has been completely rewritten by a single scratch on a stone, and no sudden declaration that everyone else is hiding the truth in a cupboard. Just a careful walk through a real place, with real questions and maybe a few gentle jokes along the way, because even a mysterious megalith deserves good manners and the occasional smile. Now settle in. Let the noise of the day step back a little. Imagine the air growing thinner and cooler as the road climbs away from the more familiar parts of Peru. The landscape begins to change. The sharp lines of the Andes rise around you. Valleys open and close. Mist gathers in pockets. The mountains are green in some places, brown and stony in others, and everywhere they seem older than any map. This is not the Peru most visitors first imagine when they think of Machu Picchu, with its famous terraces and postcard-perfect ridge. Yurac Rumi belongs to a quieter story, one farther from the crowds, in the Vilcabamba region of Cusco, where the Inca world did not simply end when the Spanish entered the old imperial capital. It withdrew, regrouped, adapted, and held on. The name Vilcabamba carries a certain weight in Andean history. It was the region of the Neo-Inca state, the last centre of Inca resistance after the conquest disrupted the heart of the empire. When people speak of the last Incas, they're often speaking in part of these rugged valleys and mountain strongholds. Here, political power, sacred geography, and survival became tightly woven together. This was not just a hiding place. It was a landscape where authority could still be performed, where rituals could still take place, where the old order could continue in altered form, even under pressure from a world that had changed suddenly and violently. Yurac Rumi lies near the archaeological complex often called Nuestra Hispana or Nuestra Hispana, not far from Vitcos, a site associated with Inca nobility in the final years of independent Inca rule. That setting matters. A strange stone in an empty field is interesting. A strange stone beside a ceremonial area linked to one of the most dramatic periods of Andean history is something else, entirely. It becomes part of a larger pattern. The Inca were not simply builders of walls and roads, though they were very good at both. They were organisers of landscape. They saw mountains, springs, stones, caves, and celestial movements as active parts of the world. A rock was not always just a rock. Sometimes it was a marker, a shrine, a place of encounter, a point where human order and natural power touched. This is one of the first things to keep in mind when we look at Yurac Rumi. Modern eyes often separate things into categories. A building is architecture, a statue is art, a spring is water, a mountain is geology, a temple is religion. The Inca did not necessarily divide the world in that way. A carved rock could be architecture, sacred object, political symbol, and landscape feature all at once. It could be shaped by human hands without becoming separate from nature. In fact, that may have been the point. The most impressive Inca stonework often does not simply dominate the landscape. It converses with it. Terraces follow slopes, walls lock into bedrock, sacred stones echo surrounding peaks. The built and the natural are not enemies. They are partners, though one of them is much heavier and less likely to answer questions directly. Yurac Rumi belongs to this tradition, but it also stands out within it. The stone is not a neat rectangular block placed into a wall. It's a large outcrop, a mass of rock left in place and transformed. The carvings do not erase its natural form. They work around it and into it. Some sections appear flattened or cut. Others retain the irregular personality of the original stone. This creates the feeling that the object is both made and found. It is not quite a building, not quite a sculpture, not quite a natural feature, and not quite any simple thing at all. No wonder people call it confusing. It is doing several jobs at once, and it has had centuries to perfect the art of not explaining itself. When viewers first encounter images of Yurac Rumi, they often notice the precision. There are edges and angles that look carefully planned. Some carved areas seem almost like miniature stairways, platforms, or symbolic architectural forms. Other sections contain channels that may have guided water across or around the stone. Nearby there are features associated with ceremonial use, including a spring and built elements that suggest the site was not casual. This was not someone doodling on a boulder because they had a free afternoon and a very determined chisel. The labour involved would have required intention, skill, and a reason strong enough to justify shaping a massive stone in a remote mountain setting. That reason is where the mystery begins to deepen. It is easy to say, ceremony, and ceremony was almost certainly part of the story, but the word can become a blanket we throw over anything we do not fully understand. What kind of ceremony? For whom? On what dates? Connected to which water source? Which mountain? Which lineage? Which ruler? Which crisis? Which memory? A shrine can be a very specific thing. It can be used for offerings, rulership, purification, seasonal events, ancestor veneration, astronomical observation, or communication with powerful features of the landscape. Sometimes it can hold several of these meanings at once. Yurac Rumi may have been a sacred stone, but that phrase is only the doorway, not the whole room. There is also the simple matter of craft. Ancient Andean stonework has a way of making modern people underestimate ancient patience. We look at hard stone, tight joins, smooth planes, and carefully cut forms, and because we're used to power tools, we imagine that the absence of modern machinery must mean impossibility. But human beings with time, organisation, skill, and a strong cultural reason can do extraordinary things with tools that look modest at first glance. The Inca and other Andean cultures knew stone intimately. They quarried it, moved it, dressed it, fitted it, and gave it meaning. Their methods may not always be fully documented in every detail, but the results are visible across the Andes, from Cusco's famous walls to remote ceremonial sites, where carved bedrock still holds the shape of vanished rituals. Still, admitting ancient skill does not make Yurac Rumi boring. Quite the opposite. The mystery becomes more interesting when we respect the people who made it. If we begin with the assumption that ancient builders were helpless without lasers, we actually make the past smaller. We turn real cultures into props for our own surprise. But if we begin with the idea that Inca specialists were intelligent, observant, and deeply invested in shaping stone for religious and political purposes, then the question becomes richer. Not how could they possibly do this, but why did they choose to do this here, in this way, with this stone, at this moment in their history? That question leads us into the atmosphere of Vilcabamba itself. This was a frontier of survival, but also a sacred geography. After the Spanish conquest, the Inca rulers who withdrew into this region were not simply preserving political power, they were preserving a worldview under strain. Temples, shrines, and ceremonial spaces mattered because they tied leadership to the forces that gave legitimacy: mountains, ancestors, the sun, water, the memory of Cusco, and the living land itself. In such a context, a carved rock like Yurac Rumi could have carried meanings that were both old and urgent. It may have looked backward to establish traditions and forward to the needs of a court in exile. It may have been a place where ritual action helped hold a fractured world together. There are accounts suggesting that Spanish religious authorities later tried to suppress or destroy sacred places in the region, including shrines associated with Inca worship. This also tells us something. Conquerors and missionaries did not usually bother attacking objects that meant nothing. When a sacred stone was burned, defaced, exorcised, or reinterpreted, it was often because it still held power in the eyes of local people. The damage itself becomes a kind of historical evidence, not of what the stone originally looked like in every detail, but of how seriously it was taken. A quiet rock can become a battlefield when two worldviews meet, especially if one side suspects the other side's stone is not merely decorative. And yet, Yurac Rumi survives, weathered, altered, and no doubt missing some of the context that once made it easier to understand, but still there. That is one of the reasons it continues to attract attention. It is not hidden entirely, but it is not as globally familiar as Machu Picchu. It occupies that fascinating middle space where travellers, archaeologists, photographers, and curious viewers can encounter something remarkable without feeling that every angle has already been explained on a souvenir mug. The stone still feels remote, even when seen online. It has not been flattened by fame, it remains stubbornly itself. So when we say, "This Peruvian megalith doesn't make sense," we should hear that phrase gently. It does not mean the stone is irrational. It means our usual categories are not quite enough. It means the object asks more from us than a quick answer. It asks us to think about Inca religion, mountain landscapes, the role of carved bedrock, the trauma of conquest, the persistence of sacred places, and the limits of modern interpretation. It asks us to slow down, which is considerate of it, really, given the purpose of this channel. Tonight's journey will begin with that first encounter, the stone waiting in the valley. We will approach it not as a puzzle to be conquered, but as a place to be understood as carefully as we can. We will notice its surfaces, its setting, its relationship with water and ruins nearby. We will step back into the final Inca strongholds of Vilcabamba and ask what kind of world could produce a stone like this. We will think about tools and labour, but also about belief, because ancient monuments are rarely just engineering problems. They are human decisions made solid. Sometimes very, very solid. And perhaps, as we move closer, we may find that Yurac Rumi does make sense after all, just not in the impatient way we expect. It may make sense as a shrine rather than a machine, as a living part of a sacred landscape rather than an isolated object, as a statement of continuity in a time of disruption, and as a reminder that the past does not become simple just because we arrive late. The stone has been waiting a long time. It can wait a little longer while we learn how to look at it properly. So let the mountains gather around the edge of the imagination. Let the road narrow and the air cool. Somewhere beyond the busier paths of Peru, beyond the postcards and familiar names, a pale carved rock rests near the old Inca places of Vilcabamba. It has steps that do not behave like ordinary steps, surfaces that seem too deliberate to be accidental, and a silence that has outlasted empire, conquest, weather, and every confident explanation placed upon it. And before we ask what it was for, or how it was made, or why it still unsettles the eye, we should first arrive there slowly as the valley opens and the white rock comes into view. The road toward Yurac Rumi does not behave like a grand entrance. There is no enormous gateway announcing that you have arrived at one of the stranger carved stones of the Inca world. No marble sign, no neat museum corridor, no velvet rope politely protecting the mystery from fingerprints. Instead, the journey belongs to the mountains. You move through the Vilcabamba region, where the land folds and rises in green, uneven layers, where paths bend around slopes, where vegetation crowds close, and where the air seems to change its mind every few minutes. One moment the valley feels open and bright. The next, cloud and shadow settle over it, and everything becomes quieter. It is the sort of landscape that makes distance feel uncertain. A place may be close by the map and still feel far away underfoot, which is one of the Andes' favourite little tricks. Yurac Rumi is not far from Vitcos, the old Inca site often identified with Rosa Sparta, a place tied to the final period of Inca rule in Vilcabamba. That nearby presence matters. Vitcos was not just another ruin scattered on a hillside. It was linked to the rulers who withdrew into the mountains after the Spanish occupation of Cusco, a political and ceremonial centre in a time when the old empire had been broken but not entirely silenced. To walk toward Yurac Rumi, then, is not simply to approach a carved stone. It is to move through the outer edge of a late Inca world, one that was under pressure, watchful, and still deeply concerned with ritual, authority, and the sacred order of the landscape. The valley itself becomes part of the story before the stone ever appears. This is one of the first quiet surprises about the place. Yurac Rumi does not stand alone in the way a modern monument might stand alone, isolated on a plaza for people to circle and admire. It belongs to a small, ceremonial complex, set within a steep-sided valley, with traces of buildings, terraces and water features around it. The carved rock sits near a spring, and that spring is not a minor detail. In the Andes, water was never just a useful substance that came out of the ground and helped with the crops, though of course it did that too. Springs could be sacred. They could be places of origin, purification, fertility, and connection with forces beneath the earth. A spring emerging near a carved white rock in a region tied to the last Inca rulers is not something to shrug at and say, "Ah yes, plumbing." The Inca were good at practical engineering, but they also lived in a world where the practical and the sacred often shared the same channel. The stone itself waits at the centre of this setting, large, pale, and worked into forms that are difficult to summarise neatly. It is often called the White Rock because of the meaning of its Quechua name, but even that simple name feels modest when you begin to look closely. It is not just a white rock, it is a natural outcrop that has been cut, shaped, and incorporated into a ceremonial space. Some of its surfaces look like steps. Others look like platforms, seats, grooves, basins, or channels. There are areas that seem deliberately smoothed and angled, while other parts retain the rougher character of stone that has been left partly as it was found. This mixture gives Yurac Rumi its strange power. It does not look entirely manufactured, and it does not look entirely natural. It sits between those categories, which is exactly where many of the most interesting Inca sacred places seem to sit. A person coming from the modern world may expect a monument to declare its purpose. A temple should look like a temple. A throne should look like a throne. A drain should look like a drain. A staircase should lead somewhere, preferably somewhere useful, and not simply climb up a carved surface and leave you wondering whether you have misunderstood the concept of stairs. Yurac Rumi is not so helpful. It contains forms that resemble familiar things without settling into any one function. A carved ledge may look like a seat, but was it actually sat upon? A channel may have carried water, but was it practical, ceremonial, symbolic, or all of those at once? A set of cut planes may appear architectural, but was it meant to represent a building, a mountain, a ritual map, or something we have no modern word for? This stone does not refuse interpretation exactly, it simply refuses to be rushed. There is something almost uncomfortable about that for us, because modern curiosity likes answers quickly. We see an object and we want a label, we want a diagram, a date, a purpose, and perhaps a helpful arrow saying, "This is the important bit." But ancient sacred landscapes rarely work like instruction manuals. They were not designed for strangers arriving centuries later with cameras, hiking shoes, and mild concern about battery life. They were designed for people who already understood the stories, gestures, ceremonies, and meanings attached to them. Yurac Rumi may have been perfectly legible to those who used it. The confusion is partly ours. We are entering a conversation after most of the speakers have gone quiet. Still, it is not wrong to feel puzzled. The stone is genuinely unusual. Even in a region famous for remarkable stonework, Yurac Rumi has a character of its own. It is not the clean polygonal masonry of Cusco, where blocks lock together so tightly that people still try, and fail, to fit a credit card between them. It is not a fortress wall, not a terrace system, not a palace doorway. It is a carved body of bedrock shaped in place, integrated with water, and built spaces around it. This kind of work asks us to think less like builders inspecting a construction project, and more like visitors entering a ritual environment. The question is not only how the rock was carved, the question is why this rock, here, in this valley, beside this spring, near this late Inca centre, was worth shaping with such care. When you imagine approaching it, try not to picture a single dramatic reveal, as though the stone suddenly leaps into view with thunder in the background. In reality, the experience is probably gentler than that. The valley narrows, the ground changes beneath your feet. You become aware of terraces and old walls, of the way human hands once arranged the space, not by overwhelming the landscape, but by guiding it. The spring gives the place a sense of movement. Water is still doing what water does, slipping through the world with more patience than any empire. And then the stone is there, not performing, not explaining, simply occupying the centre of the place, as if it has always known it was the main reason people would come. At first the size may catch your attention, then the surfaces, then the cuts. Your eyes begin to follow one line, then another. The forms do not organise themselves into one simple picture. This is part of what makes photographs of Yurac Rumi so intriguing and sometimes misleading. A single image can show a striking angle, but it cannot fully communicate the way the stone relates to the ground, the water, the ruins nearby, and the surrounding valley. A carved rock in a photograph becomes an object. A carved rock in its landscape becomes a place, and Yurac Rumi is very much a place. The spring beneath or beside the rock gives us one of the strongest clues. In many Andean traditions, places where water emerged from the earth were not neutral. They were points of contact with the hidden world below, with mountains, ancestors, and the living forces of the land. The Inca state, for all its roads, storehouses, armies, and administrators, also depended on sacred geography. Power was not only held in palaces, it was anchored in huacas, sacred places or objects that could include stones, springs, caves, mountains, mummies, and other features charged with meaning. To modern ears, the word sacred object can sound small, like something kept in a glass case. But a huaca could be a living presence in the social and political world. It could receive offerings. It could legitimize authority. It could mark a relationship between people and place. It could be feared, honored, visited, and remembered. Seen in that light, Yurac Rumi begins to make more sense, though not in a way that removes its mystery. The rock was not necessarily meant to be decoded like a puzzle. It may have been meant to be used, approached, touched, seen in relation to ceremonies, water, light, and movement. Its carved surfaces may have directed bodies as much as thoughts. A person might stand here, sit there, pour liquid along a channel, place offerings in a hollow, face a certain direction, or witness an action performed by someone with authority. The meaning would not have been contained in the stone alone. It would have unfolded through ritual. Without the ritual, we're left with the stage after the performance has ended, still powerful, but missing the voices, gestures, music, smoke, food, drink, textiles, and people who once made the space complete. There is also the matter of whiteness. The name Yurac Rumi, white rock, sounds simple, but colour can matter in sacred settings. A pale stone stands out in a green valley. It catches light differently. It may look especially striking when wet, when sunlight shifts across it, or when mist makes the surrounding landscape softer and darker. We should be careful not to invent meanings too confidently from colour alone, because ancient symbolism is not a game of matching paint samples. Still, the visual presence of a pale carved rock at the heart of a shrine would have been hard to ignore. It must have drawn the eye. It still does. Around the stone, traces of architecture suggest that this was not an isolated natural curiosity occasionally visited by shepherds with spare time. The complex included built spaces, and historical accounts describe the shrine as important enough to be associated with attendance and religious activity. This is where the valley changes from scenery into evidence. A carved stone beside a spring might already suggest sacred meaning. Add surrounding buildings, proximity to Vitcos, and accounts of Spanish efforts to suppress the shrine, and the picture becomes stronger. Whatever exact ceremonies took place there, Yurac Rumi was significant. It was not an accident of geology that happened to look interesting from the right angle. The Spanish response to places like this is part of the story, though it should be handled carefully. When Christian missionaries and colonial authorities encountered Andean shrines, they often saw them not as heritage sites, certainly not as archaeology, but as active religious threats. Sacred stones could be burned, defaced, renamed, or ritually attacked in attempts to destroy their power. In the case of Yurac Rumi, Old accounts speak of efforts to burn or damage the shrine during the time of Titu Cusi Yupanqui, one of the Inca rulers in Vilcabamba. This is a grim reminder that the stone was not always quiet. It existed in a contested world. To local people, it may have remained powerful. To Spanish religious figures, that power was something to be broken. To us, centuries later, the marks of that conflict are part of why the place feels so heavy with unanswered questions. Imagine that for a moment. A stone in a valley, carefully shaped, attended, ritually important, possibly connected with the sun, water, and Inca authority. Then outsiders arrive with a different religion and a determination to end the practices tied to it. The rock, which had once gathered ceremony around itself, becomes a target, not because it moved, not because it spoke in any ordinary way, but because people believed it mattered. That is one of the strangest truths about sacred stones. Their power is both material and social. They are heavy, visible, and enduring, but their meaning lives in the relationships people build around them. Break those relationships and the stone becomes harder to understand. Break the stone and the relationships may still continue in memory, resistance, or quiet practice. History is rarely tidy, which is inconsiderate of it, but very common. The valley itself also plays a role in preserving the mood of the place. Vilcabamba is not a flat, open landscape where everything can be seen at once. It is mountainous, vegetated, and layered. The Inca presence here was shaped by terrain. Paths, settlements, shrines, and defensive choices all had to respond to slopes, rivers, ridges, and the difficulty of movement. That geography helped the last Inca rulers maintain independence for a time after other centres had fallen. But it also gave sacred places a particular intimacy. A shrine tucked into a valley can feel enclosed, almost protected by the surrounding land. The experience of arriving there would have been different from approaching a vast open plaza. It would have been more contained, more focused, with the rock and spring forming the centre of attention. This may help explain why Yurac Rumi feels so different from the monumental public spaces people often imagine when they think of empire. The Inca Empire was enormous, stretching across diverse environments and incorporating many peoples, but its sacred geography could be intensely local. A single stone, a single spring, a single mountain view could matter deeply. Imperial power did not always need to announce itself with huge buildings. Sometimes it worked by recognizing, reshaping, and organizing places already charged with meaning. A natural outcrop could become an imperial shrine. A spring could become part of a ceremonial system. A valley could become a sacred setting tied to rulership and memory. That combination of local landscape and imperial craft is one of the reasons Yurac Rumi resists simple explanations. If we look only for practical purpose, we miss the ritual. If we look only for symbolism, we miss the engineering. If we look only for mystery, we miss the history. The stone is not strange because ancient people could not have carved it. It is strange because it preserves an entire way of thinking in a form we can see but not fully enter. It is like finding the remains of a sentence in a language you partly know. You can recognize some words, you can guess the grammar, you may even understand the mood, but the exact meaning slips away. And perhaps that is why Yurac Rumi continues to attract the kind of attention it does. It gives the eye enough order to know it was made with intention, and enough ambiguity to keep the mind restless. A plain boulder would not hold us for long. A completely understood monument might satisfy us and then let us move on. Yurac Rumi does something more interesting. It invites recognition, then withholds certainty. It allows us to say, this is a shrine, while still asking, yes, but what exactly happened here? It allows us to say this was carved by the Inca, while still asking why these shapes, in this arrangement, on this stone. That is not a failure of archaeology. That is the normal condition of studying a place where material remains have outlived the full ceremony that gave them meaning. As the day shifts in the valley, the stone would change too. Morning light might sharpen one set of edges. Afternoon shadow might make the channels more visible. Rain might darken surfaces and draw attention to the water's path. Mist might soften the surrounding walls and leave the pale rock standing out more clearly. These changes are not decoration. In a culture attentive to landscape, sky, water, and seasonal cycles, the changing appearance of a shrine could have mattered. We do not need to imagine elaborate hidden machinery to understand that light and water were already powerful enough. The world itself supplied the movement. The stone supplied the focus. Standing there in the mind, looking at the white rock in its small valley, it becomes easier to understand why calling it merely a megalith feels incomplete. The word megalith simply means large stone, and Yurac Rumi is certainly that, but it is also a worked place, a ritual centre, a survivor of conquest, and a reminder that Inca stonework was not limited to walls that impress engineers. It could also produce sacred forms that confuse modern categories. This is not a stone waiting to be solved by one clever phrase. It is a stone waiting to be placed back into its world. And that world is still visible in fragments. The spring still emerges. The valley still gathers around it. Vitcos still stands nearby in ruin and memory. The carved surfaces still hold the marks of deliberate work. Even the damage and weathering have become part of its biography. If the original ceremonies are gone, the setting has not entirely lost its voice. It speaks more softly now, and perhaps less clearly, but it speaks through placement, through form, through the stubborn survival of stone. The task is not to force it to speak our language too quickly. So we remain with it a little longer, not rushing toward conclusions. The white rock sits in its valley like an object that has seen too many centuries to be impressed by our impatience. Around it, the remains of buildings suggest human order. Beneath it, or close by, the spring carries water from the mountain. Beyond it, the ruins of Vitcos remind us of rulers, resistance, and a world trying to continue under pressure. And across its surface, cut lines and shaped spaces begin to pull the eye into a more difficult question, because the longer one looks at Yurac Rumi, the less it seems like a single carved boulder, and the more it seems like a design whose rules have not been fully recovered, a shape too strange for ordinary hands only because the hands that made it belong to a world of stone, water, power, and meaning that we are still learning how to see. The first thing that makes Yurac Rumi feel difficult is not simply that it is large or old or carved from stone. The Andes are full of large old stones, and the Inca were famously comfortable turning difficult rock into astonishing architecture. What makes this particular stone so arresting is the way its shape seems to hover between several ideas at once. It looks partly like a natural outcrop, partly like a ceremonial platform, partly like a miniature landscape, and partly like something whose function has slipped out of reach. The eye wants to organise it. It wants to say, that is a stairway, or that is a seat, or that is a channel for water, and sometimes those descriptions may be close to the truth, but then the next surface interrupts. A ledge stops where a modern stair should continue. A carved plane turns at an angle that feels more symbolic than practical. A hollow may look useful, but for what exactly? The longer you look, the more the stone seems to answer every question with another surface. This is where the phrase, too strange for ordinary hands, becomes tempting, but we have to handle it carefully. It is easy to look at ancient stonework and imagine that the only explanation for skill is impossibility. The mind leaps from, I do not understand how this was made, to, perhaps nobody could have made it, which is a very human leap, but not always a helpful one. Yurac Rumi was not too strange for human hands. It was made by human hands, or at least shaped by them, with a degree of patience and understanding that deserves more respect than disbelief. The strangeness lies not in the idea that people carved it, but in the fact that the carving does not fit neatly into our modern expectations of what a carved object should be. We're used to tools serving clear purposes, buildings having rooms, stairs leading upward, and seats being made for sitting. Inca sacred stonework could be far more layered than that. It could be practical, symbolic, ritual, political, and landscape-based at the same time. A single line cut into rock might guide water, mark direction, echo a mountain form, and frame an action in a ceremony. Ancient design was not always in the business of being convenient for future documentaries. Imagine placing your hand near one of those carved edges, not touching it roughly, not claiming it, just noticing the relationship between the cut surface and the rougher stone around it. The worked areas create a conversation between intention and geology. A completely carved block would tell one kind of story. A raw boulder would tell another. Yurac Rumi tells both at once. The Inca, or the Andean specialists working under Inca authority, did not simply remove the natural rock and replace it with architecture. They used the rock as it was, then sharpened certain parts of it into meaning. They seem to have selected surfaces, angles and protrusions that could be drawn out rather than erased. This is important because it reminds us that ancient Andean stonework was often not about conquering nature in the modern sense. It was about revealing, organising and activating certain qualities already present in the landscape. The stone may have been seen not as dead material waiting for improvement, but as something with presence before the first tool struck it. That difference changes everything. If a builder sees stone as inert material, the goal is to cut it into whatever shape the design demands. If a ritual specialist sees stone as a powerful feature of the land, the goal may be more careful. You do not simply impose a shape. You negotiate with the form already there. You preserve parts. You alter others. You create a place where the natural and the human-made remain visibly joined. This may be why Yurac Rumi has such a peculiar character. It does not look like a block extracted from a quarry and forced into a plan. It looks like a rock that was recognised, chosen, and then worked until it became part of a ceremonial system. In that sense, its oddness may be exactly the point. Some of the carved areas appear almost architectural. There are forms that resemble steps, terraces, platforms, and small ledges, as if a tiny version of an Inca-built environment has been cut into the surface. It is tempting to call these things models, and in some Andean sites carved rocks do seem to reflect or miniaturize landscapes, buildings, or sacred arrangements. But we should avoid becoming too confident too quickly. A carved step on a sacred rock is not automatically a model staircase. It might be a place for offerings. It might represent ascent, hierarchy, or access to a sacred realm. It might have guided the movement of liquid during a ritual. It might have been used in ways that combined all of these things and made perfect sense to the people who stood there. The difficulty is that modern observers often want a single function, while ritual objects often survive because they held several functions at once. There are also surfaces that seem deliberately smoothed or flattened, and these are especially interesting because flattening stone takes effort. It is one thing to knock off a rough edge. It is another to create a surface that appears prepared, controlled, and visually distinct from the natural rock around it. A smoothed plane can create a place for standing, placing, pouring, viewing, or reflecting light. It can also make a stone look less like a random outcrop and more like a stage for action. When people gather around a carved shrine, the surface does not have to explain itself through words. It guides behaviour through form. A ledge says, place something here. A basin says, let something collect here. A channel says, let something pass this way. A raised platform says, look here, or stand here, or recognise this as set apart. These messages may not be as direct as a signpost, but they are not meaningless. Water is one of the strongest clues in this conversation. Yurac Rumi's relationship with the nearby spring suggests that at least some of its carved features may have been connected with liquid movement. In Andean ritual life, water could carry meanings of fertility, renewal, purification, and connection to the underground forces of the earth. It was also a practical necessity, of course, and that is part of what makes it powerful. Sacred things are often strongest when they are also necessary. A spring feeds crops, animals, and people, but it also emerges mysteriously from hidden places. It appears out of the ground as if the mountain itself is giving something. To build a shrine around such a source is not strange at all. It is a deeply human response to a landscape that gives life. If liquid moved across Yurac Rumi's carved surfaces, the stone may have been animated during ritual. This is easy to miss if we imagine it dry and still. A channel without water can look like a line. A basin without liquid can look like a hole. But during a ceremony, with water, chicha, or another offering poured across stone, the forms would become active. Liquid catches light, it darkens surfaces. It follows grooves, pauses in hollows, spills over edges, and makes the rock appear to participate. A carved stone that seems puzzling in silence may have been much clearer when used. The same is true of many ritual spaces. A church without candles, song, incense, movement, or people is still recognizable, but it is not fully itself. Yurac Rumi without its ceremonies is a body without breath, still present, still powerful, but missing the actions that once explained its form. The craftsmanship itself invites a quieter kind of admiration. Inca stoneworkers did not use iron tools in the European sense, and they did not rely on wheels for construction in the way many modern people imagine necessary. Yet across their world they produced masonry, terraces, roads, canals and shrines that remain impressive centuries later. This does not require fantasy. It requires organisation, expertise, labour and time. Harder hammerstones could be used to pound and shape surfaces. Abrasion could smooth stone gradually. Repeated testing and patient removal could create edges and planes. The process was probably not quick, but the Inca state was very good at mobilising labour for projects that mattered. And if Yurac Rumi was tied to sacred authority in Vilcabamba, then the effort would have been justified not by convenience, but by meaning. This is one of the problems with asking whether ancient work was worth it in modern terms. We tend to measure usefulness by efficiency. How quickly can something be built? What does it do? How much output does it produce? But sacred projects often operate with a different logic. The labour is part of the value. The difficulty is part of the statement. A carved rock shrine says not only, "Here is a place of ceremony," but also, people cared enough to shape this place with great effort. In a society where rulers needed to demonstrate their connection to sacred forces, ancestors, mountains and the sun, stonework was not mere decoration. It was authority made visible. It told people that power could organise labour, command skill, and align itself with the landscape. Yurac Rumi's forms may therefore have been as political as they were religious. In the Inca world, those categories were not cleanly separated. Rulership depended on sacred legitimacy. The Sapa Inca was not just a king in the European sense. He was tied to divine ancestry, cosmic order, and the management of relationships between people and powerful beings or places. In the Vilcabamba period, after the Spanish had taken Cusco and shattered much of the imperial system, that legitimacy would have mattered intensely. A shrine near Vitcos may have helped maintain continuity. It could remind people that the Inca ruler still had access to sacred power, still honoured the old relationships, still stood within the proper order of the world even in exile. A carved stone in that setting was not simply a relic, it was part of a living claim. This may help us understand why the stone looks so elaborate without looking like a conventional building. It was not trying to be a house. It was not trying to be a palace. It may have been trying to make a relationship visible between ruler and land, water and stone, ritual and memory, human craft and mountain power. That kind of relationship does not always produce forms that make immediate practical sense to us. A stairway that does not lead to a doorway may still lead symbolically upward. A carved seat may not be comfortable because comfort was not the point. A channel may not irrigate a field because it was guiding a sacred liquid, not watering potatoes. Though to be fair, potatoes also deserve respect. The Andes gave the world many things, and the humble potato has done more for humanity than many emperors with much larger hats. When people online encounter images of Yurac Rumi, they sometimes focus on the precision and ask how such clean forms could have been made without modern tools. This question is understandable, but it can lead us away from the better mystery. The better mystery is not whether Inca workers could carve stone. They clearly could. The better mystery is how they decided what to carve. What rules guided the design? Was the form based on a sacred plan? Did it reference nearby mountains? Did it align with movement of the sun at certain times of year? Did it reproduce a place from Cusco? A memory of imperial geography carried into the refuge of Vilcabamba? Did its ledges and channels correspond to actions that took place during offerings? Or was it shaped over time, with additions made as the shrine's role evolved? These questions are harder than simple tool questions, because they require us to reconstruct thought, ceremony, and experience from stone. There may also be an element of deliberate ambiguity in the form. Sacred objects often gain power by not being entirely ordinary. A shrine that looks too much like everyday architecture might lose some of its special quality. Yurac Rumi's unusual shapes may have helped mark it as a place apart. It was familiar enough to be used, but strange enough to be respected. This balance is found in many sacred landscapes around the world. A standing stone, a cave mouth, a spring, a carved hilltop, or a mountain peak can become meaningful, partly because it is not quite like the places of daily life. People approach differently, they speak differently, they move differently, they bring offerings, remove hats, lower voices, or prepare themselves. The form teaches behaviour. The stone scale also matters. It is large enough to dominate its immediate setting, but not so enormous that it becomes remote. You can imagine people gathered around it close enough to see actions performed on its surface. This is different from a mountain peak, which may be sacred but distant. Yurac Rumi brings the mountain quality down to human scale. It is rock you can stand beside. It is landscape concentrated into an object. If the surrounding peaks were powerful beings in Andean thought, then a carved outcrop near a spring may have acted as a local point of contact with those forces. Not a symbol in the weak sense, like a logo on a sign, but a working place where relationships were maintained. The word megalith can sometimes make the stone sound older or more mysterious than it needs to be. People often use the term for any large ancient stone, from Stonehenge to carved boulders to things that simply look impressive in a thumbnail. Yurac Rumi is indeed a large stone, but it belongs specifically to the Inca and late Inca sacred landscape of Peru. It is not a random leftover from a forgotten global Stone Age civilization. It is rooted in Andean history. That grounding does not make it less fascinating. It makes it more fascinating because now the mystery has context. Instead of floating in a fog of vague ancientness, it sits in a real valley near real ruins connected to real historical events. The last Inca rulers, the Spanish conquest, the survival of ritual practice, and the sacred geography of Vilcabamba are all part of the stone's meaning. At the same time, we should not pretend that context answers everything. Archaeology can identify patterns, compare sites, study features, and read colonial accounts, but it cannot always recover the exact words spoken at a shrine or the thoughts of someone placing an offering on a carved ledge. Some uncertainty is permanent. This can be frustrating, but it is also honest. Yurac Rumi does not need to become a blank screen for any theory we enjoy, but it also cannot be reduced to a simple caption. The responsible position is somewhere in the middle. We know enough to reject the idea that it is impossible or inexplicable, and we do not know enough to explain every groove and surface with confidence. That is a perfectly respectable place to be, even if it is less dramatic than announcing the discovery of an ancient anti-gravity breakfast table. There is a quiet lesson here about ancient technology. Modern people often think of technology as machines, engines, electronics, and metal parts. But technology is simply skilled knowledge applied to the world. A carved shrine is technology of a different kind. It is stone technology, ritual technology, social technology. It organizes movement. It controls water. It shapes attention. It transforms a natural outcrop into a place where community, authority, and belief can gather. It does not need wires to be sophisticated. It does not need to beep, update, or ask for a password at the worst possible moment. Its sophistication lies in how many layers of meaning and function it holds in a single form. To call Yurac Rumi strange, then, is not to insult it. It is to acknowledge that it was made within a design language we only partly understand. The stone's carved surfaces belong to a world where the land itself was alive with relationships, where mountains could be ancestors or powerful beings, where water emerging from the earth deserved attention, where rulers used ritual to maintain cosmic and political order, and where stone was not just material, but presence. In that world, a shape that seems confusing to us may have been deeply coherent. The problem is not that the stone makes no sense. The problem is that we are missing much of the conversation. One useful way to look at Yurac Rumi is to stop asking what single object it resembles and start asking what it does to the person standing near it. It draws the eye along its surfaces. It encourages attention to height, direction, flow, and placement. It makes the natural rock appear ordered without making it fully artificial. It marks a central point in the valley. It connects with water. It sits near other remains that suggest controlled access and ceremonial use. It may have required people to move around it or approach certain parts in sequence. In other words, it organizes experience. That may have been one of its main functions. Not to be looked at once and understood, but to be encountered through movement and ritual. This is why the most dramatic photographs can sometimes be the least helpful. A close-up of a carved angle may make the stone look impossibly precise, while hiding the rough natural context around it. A wide shot may show the landscape but lose the details of the surface. A photograph taken in strong sunlight may emphasize sharp geometry. A photograph taken after rain may emphasize channels and texture. None of these images are false, but each one tells only part of the truth. The real object is not a single view. It is a sequence of views, changing as the visitor walks, turns, steps closer, looks down, looks up, and notices the spring. Ancient ritual spaces often work this way. Meaning is not delivered all at once. It unfolds as the body moves. That embodied experience may have been central to the stone's purpose. In many ceremonies, where people stand, who approaches, who pause, who watches, and who's allowed near the sacred object can matter enormously. A carved ledge could separate roles. A raised area could mark authority. A channel could carry an offering from one zone to another. A niche could hold something that only certain people saw. We do not know the exact choreography at Yurac Rumi, but we should assume there was one. Sacred places are rarely random gatherings around impressive rocks. They have rules, even when those rules are not written down for us. Especially then, perhaps. There is also the possibility that the stone's form reflected a larger cosmological order. Inca thought, as far as we can reconstruct it from archaeology, ethno-history, and surviving Andean traditions, often linked space, social structure, and sacred geography. Lines of shrines around Cusco, known as siques, organize sacred places in relation to the imperial center. Mountains and water sources were woven into political and ritual life. If Yurac Rumi was part of this broader way of organizing the world, then its carved shapes may have expressed relationships that are not obvious to a modern visitor. A platform might correspond to a direction. A channel might mark a flow between realms. A step might encode hierarchy. Or perhaps the form was tied to very local traditions that predated or blended with Inca rule. The Andes were not culturally uniform, and the Inca often incorporated existing sacred places into their own system, rather than starting from scratch. Very practical of them, really. If a stone already has power, one does not necessarily need to order a new one. The idea that Yurac Rumi could incorporate older local significance is especially interesting. Many major empires have absorbed sacred landscapes rather than replacing them completely. By adopting and reshaping local shrines, imperial authorities could connect themselves to the deeper legitimacy of place. The Inca were skilled at this. A natural outcrop near a spring may already have mattered before it was carved into its surviving form. The later workmanship could have intensified, formalised, or redirected that meaning. If so, Yurac Rumi may not represent a single moment of creation, but a layered history of recognition, modification, use, conflict, damage, and rediscovery. That layered history is part of why the stone feels alive, even now. Not alive in the sense that it will get up and wander off through the valley, which would be alarming for everyone involved, but alive as a historical presence. It has passed through different worlds of meaning. To Inca users, it may have been an active shrine. To Spanish missionaries, it may have been a dangerous idol or pagan site. To later local communities, it may have remained a known place with stories attached. To archaeologists, it became evidence. To travellers, it became a destination. To online viewers, it becomes a mystery. Each age adds a layer without fully erasing the previous ones. The stone keeps receiving interpretations, but it does not belong entirely to any of them. So the shape that seems too strange for ordinary hands is, in the end, strange because ordinary hands were doing something extraordinary by the standards of ordinary daily life. They were not just making a tool. They were not just making a decoration. They were creating a place where stone, water, authority and belief could meet. That required practical skill, yes, but also a shared understanding of why such skill mattered. Without that understanding, we see only the cuts and wonder why they are there. With even a little of that understanding restored, the cuts begin to look less like random oddities and more like traces of a vanished performance. And still, even after all this careful thinking, Yurac Rumi keeps some of its silence. That is not a failure. It may be the most honest thing about it. Ancient places do not owe us complete explanations. We can measure them, photograph them, compare them, and place them in a historical context, but there will always be a remainder, a part that belonged to the people who stood there when the stone was not a ruin, when water moved through its channels with purpose, when offerings were made, when the nearby buildings were occupied, and when Vilcabamba was not an archaeological region, but a living refuge of Inca power. To understand why that mattered, we have to widen the view from the stone itself to the world around it, to the last Inca stronghold in the mountains, where a broken empire continued to breathe, adapt, resist, and remember itself among the steep valleys of Vilcabamba. To understand Yurac Rumi, we have to let the stone remain where it is for a while and look outward, into the world that surrounded it, because the white rock was not carved in an empty silence. It belonged to a landscape of rulers, messengers, priests, farmers, soldiers, springs, terraces, mountain paths, and uneasy negotiations. It belonged to Vilcabamba, the last refuge of Inca power, a region that became, for a few difficult decades, both a hiding place and a kingdom, both a memory of what had been lost and a stubborn attempt to continue. If Cusco had been the heart of the Inca world, then Vilcabamba was something like its last deep breath in the mountains, drawn quietly but with great determination. The story begins with collapse, though not a simple one. The Inca Empire, or Tawantinsuyu, had stretched across a vast portion of western South America, linking coast, highlands and forest edges through roads, storehouses, officials, armies, and ritual obligations. It was not an empire in the European style, and it was not a single smooth machine, despite how impressive its organisation could be. It was a living system of many peoples, languages, local traditions, sacred places, and political relationships held together by force, diplomacy, labour, religion, and the authority of the Sapa Inca. Then, in the early 16th century, that system was struck by disaster from several directions at once. Disease had already moved ahead of Europeans, weakening populations before many communities ever saw a Spaniard. A brutal civil war between the brothers Huasca and Atahualpa tore the ruling family apart. Then Francisco Pizarro and his small but ruthless group of Spaniards arrived at the worst possible moment for the empire, and the most convenient possible moment for themselves, which is usually how history behaves when it's in one of its less polite moods. Cusco, the great imperial capital, fell under Spanish control, but that did not mean the Inca world simply ended. Empires do not vanish like smoke because one city is taken, especially when that empire is made of roads, loyalties, sacred obligations, and people who still remember how things were supposed to be. For a time, the Spanish tried to rule through an Inca figurehead, and one of the most important of these was Manco Inca. At first, Manco cooperated with the Spanish, or at least endured them, because the situation was dangerous and choices were limited. But he soon came to understand that cooperation with men who treated the royal household as a prize cabinet was not going to preserve Inca authority. The relationship turned bitter. Manco escaped, raised a rebellion, and in 1536 laid siege to Cusco in one of the great dramatic moments of the conquest. For months, the city became a battlefield between a newly arrived colonial force and an Andean power trying to throw it back. The siege failed, but failure did not end resistance. Manco Inca withdrew first to places closer to Cusco, then deeper into the mountains of Vilcabamba. This move was not just flight, it was strategy. Vilcabamba was difficult country, with steep valleys, forested slopes, river crossings, and routes that were not easy for outsiders to control. The region lay between the high Andes and the eastern lowlands, close enough to maintain connections, remote enough to frustrate invasion. It was a landscape that could hide an army, protect a court, and exhaust anyone trying to march through it in heavy armour, while pretending not to be miserable. The Andes are beautiful, but they do not especially care about the ambitions of men wearing metal hats. In Vilcabamba, the Inca state continued in reduced but meaningful form. Historians often call it the Neo-Inca state, though of course the people living there did not wake up each morning saying, "How pleasant to be part of a Neo-Inca state." To them, this was still Inca rule, still royal authority, still a world in which rituals had to be performed, crops had to be grown, alliances had to be maintained, and enemies had to be watched. It was smaller than the old empire, but it was not imaginary. It had rulers, settlements, soldiers, diplomacy, ceremonies, and a court. It made war, negotiated peace, received messengers, and tried to survive between the Spanish colonial world to the west and the deep forests and independent peoples to the east. This is important because Vilcabamba was not merely a cave where the last Incas hid, with a few sentimental objects and a gloomy playlist. It was a working political landscape. It had centres such as Vitcos, associated with royal residence and ceremony, and deeper jungle sites such as Espiritu Pampa, often identified with the final capital of Vilcabamba. The region contained agricultural land, roads, shrines, defensive positions, and places where the Inca could still enact the rituals that made authority visible. Power needs food, paths, water, symbols, and witnesses. Vilcabamba had all of these, though in a more precarious form than the empire had known before. Vitcos near Yurac Rumi was one of the key places in this mountain refuge. The site sits in a region where highland and cloud forest worlds begin to meet, where the Inca could look outward across routes of movement and control. It was not as vast or polished in reputation as Cusco, but in the story of resistance it carries great weight. Here, Inca rulers could still perform kingship. Here, the court could gather. Here, messengers could arrive with news from Cusco, from Spanish authorities, from rebellious allies, from local chiefs, and from the shifting edges of a world under conquest. One imagines the atmosphere as tense but active, not a frozen ruin, not yet. A living place with conversations, decisions, suspicions, meals, ceremonies, and perhaps the occasional person quietly wishing politics would become less complicated before lunch. Near this setting, Yurac Rumi becomes much more than an odd carved stone. It becomes part of a royal and sacred landscape. The Spanish had taken Cusco, but they had not taken every mountain, every spring, every memory, or every ritual. In Vilcabamba, Sacred places mattered because they helped hold the identity of the Inca world together. A ruler in exile needed more than weapons. He needed legitimacy. He needed connection to ancestors, to the sun, to the land, to the sacred geography that had always underwritten Inca power. Yurac Rumi may have helped provide that connection. The White Rock and its spring may have been a place where the old relationships were maintained, where offerings and rituals linked the present crisis to an older order. Manco Inca's reign in Vilcabamba was not peaceful. He continued to resist Spanish power, though the balance of force shifted constantly. Spaniards fought him, negotiated with him, betrayed him, and feared him. His court became both a political refuge and a dangerous frontier. In 1544, Manco was killed by Spaniards who had taken shelter with him after their own conflicts among the conquerors. It is a grim little detail that feels almost absurd if it were not so tragic. Men given refuge within the Inca ruler's world turned on him and murdered him. History has many examples of hospitality ending badly, but this one sits with particular bitterness. After Manco's death, leadership passed through his sons, and Vilcabamba continued. Sayri Tupac, one of Manco's sons, eventually left Vilcabamba and accepted Spanish terms, moving into the colonial world with lands and privileges. This could be seen as surrender, diplomacy, survival, or all three depending on where one is standing. Another son, Titu Cusi Yupanqui, became the most important ruler of Vilcabamba after him. Titu Cusi is a fascinating figure because he lived between worlds. He negotiated with the Spanish, received missionaries, allowed some Christian presence, and even accepted baptism as Diego de Castro. But he did not simply become a colonial subject in any ordinary sense. His relationship with Christianity and Spanish authority remained complicated, strategic, and uneasy. He knew the power of negotiation, but he also knew the value of distance. Vilcabamba under Titu Cusi was not a forgotten relic. It was a political actor. During Titu Cusi's rule, the tension between Andean ritual life and Christian missionary ambition became especially sharp. Spanish friars entered Vilcabamba hoping to convert, persuade, and reshape the religious world of the Inca court. From their perspective, shrines like Yurac Rumi were dangerous remnants of idolatry. From the Inca perspective, those same shrines were likely part of the order that connected ruler, land, ancestors, and divine forces. This was not a minor disagreement over decoration. It was a collision over what made the world real and lawful. If one side sees a carved stone as a sacred place, and the other sees it as a false idol to be destroyed, the stone itself becomes a meeting point for conflict. Accounts tell of missionaries burning or damaging the shrine at Yurac Rumi during Titu Cusi's absence. This moment is worth slowing down over because it reveals how alive the shrine still was. Nobody stages a dramatic religious attack on a stone they believe to be culturally irrelevant. The missionaries were not removing an abandoned curiosity. They were attacking a place that mattered, and the reaction was severe enough that Titu Cusi reportedly had to intervene to protect the friars from local anger. That detail, if we sit with it quietly, is almost more revealing than the destruction itself. It suggests that the shrine's importance was not just official, it was felt. People cared. The White Rock was not a passive artifact waiting to become archaeology. It was part of a living religious world that colonial Christianity was trying to interrupt. It is possible to imagine the scene without turning it into melodrama. A sacred place near a spring. Priests, attendants, local people, perhaps members of the Inca court. Missionaries arriving with conviction and fear, seeing in the carved stone not beauty or heritage, but a rival power. Fire, damage, anger, confusion. An Inca ruler forced to manage a crisis between his own people and the foreign religious figures he had permitted into his realm. The valley that feels so still today once held a very human storm. That is one reason the stone seems charged. Its silence is not empty. It is the silence after argument, after ritual, after violence, after abandonment. Titu Cusi died in 1571, and his death set off another crisis. The Spanish soon blamed the missionaries' mistreatment, local tensions and political instability in ways that hardened their attitude toward Vilcabamba. His brother Tupac Amaru became the final Inca ruler of the refuge. In 1572, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo launched the military campaign that would end independent Inca rule. Spanish forces and their indigenous allies entered Vilcabamba, captured Tupac Amaru, and brought him to Cusco, where he was executed. The death of Tupac Amaru marked the symbolic end of the Inca royal line as an independent political power. It did not end Andean culture, belief, resistance, or memory, of course. People do not disappear because a ruler is killed in a plaza. But it did end the last recognised Inca state holding out against Spanish authority. Afterward, Vilcabamba changed. Some settlements were abandoned. Populations were moved. Ritual practices connected to places like Yurac Rumi faded, transformed, or went underground. The old centres lost their court, their attendants, their official role. Forest and weather began the long work of covering what politics had broken. Paths became less travelled. Buildings collapsed. Names shifted. Outsiders forgot locations. Local memory often remained in some form, but the wider colonial and scholarly world lost track of which. Ruin corresponded to which historical place. This is how places become lost, though that word can be misleading. A city may be lost to outsiders and still known to people who live nearby. A ruin may be absent from European maps and still present in local stories, fields and paths. Lost, very often, means lost by the people who later wrote the books. Centuries later, explorers and scholars came searching for the last cities of the Incas, and Vilcabamba began to re-enter global attention. This rediscovery had its own confusion. Sites were identified, misidentified, debated, renamed, and photographed. Hiram Bingham, famous for bringing Machu Picchu to international attention in 1911, also visited sites in the Vilcabamba region, including Vitcos and the shrine now known as Yurac Rumi. Bingham was not the first human being to know these places existed, of course, and it's always good to remember that discovery is a word with a rather large ego. But his expeditions helped place the region back into international archaeological discussion. The White Rock became visible again to a wider audience, though still not nearly as famous as the stone terraces of Machu Picchu. And perhaps that is fortunate in a way. Fame can flatten a place. It can turn complex history into a postcard. Vilcabamba, by contrast, still has rough edges in the public imagination. It is remembered as a refuge, a resistance zone, a place of final chapters and hidden roads. But it was more than an ending, it was a continuation under pressure. The people of Vilcabamba were not merely waiting for history to finish them. They farmed, fought, negotiated, worshipped, ruled, adapted, and made choices within terrible constraints. A place like Yurac Rumi becomes meaningful because it belonged to that ongoing life. It was not carved for us to admire from a safe distance. It was part of how a community maintained order, identity, and sacred connection in a time of upheaval. This is where the lost Inca world of Vilcabamba becomes especially important to the mystery of the stone. If Yurac Rumi had been built in the imperial capital at the height of Inca power, we might read it one way, as confident, official, central, part of a strong and expanding state. But in Vilcabamba, near the last royal centres, it carries a slightly different feeling. It may reflect continuity, but continuity under threat. It may have preserved older traditions while also serving the urgent needs of a court in exile. The stone could have been a way of saying that the sacred order still held, even though Cusco was occupied. The water still flowed. The ritual still mattered. The ruler still stood in relation to the powerful places of the land. The world had been wounded, but it had not become meaningless. That idea helps us avoid one of the common traps in thinking about conquest. It is easy to imagine history as a clean before and after. Before the Spanish, the Inca world existed. After the Spanish, it ended. But real history is messier. The conquest was a long process, not a single event. Indigenous power did not vanish immediately. Spanish control was uneven. Alliances shifted. Local communities negotiated, resisted, adapted, and survived in different ways. Vilcabamba is one of the clearest reminders of that messy middle. For nearly 4 decades after the fall of Cusco, an Inca royal court continued to exist in the mountains. That is not a footnote. That is a generation. Children were born into that world who knew no memory of the empire at its height, but still lived under Inca rulers in a landscape shaped by resistance. Imagine being one of those people. The old stories of Cusco would still matter, but Cusco itself would be in foreign hands. The roads would still connect communities, but some roads would now bring danger. The sun would still rise over the mountains, rituals would still be necessary, crops would still need tending, and yet the political world around you would have changed beyond recognition. In such a life, a shrine like Yurac Rumi might offer more than religious practice. It might offer continuity. It might say, here is a place where the old relationships still function. Here is water from the mountain. Here is stone shaped by our hands. Here is a ruler, or priest, or ritual specialist performing what must be performed. Here, at least for a moment, the world is not entirely broken. This does not mean Vilcabamba was a peaceful sanctuary. It was also a place of anxiety, violence, diplomacy, and hard choices. The Inca rulers there had to decide when to fight and when to negotiate, when to allow missionaries and when to expel them, when to accept gifts and when to distrust them. Spanish authorities, for their part, saw Vilcabamba as both a nuisance and a danger, a place that could inspire rebellion beyond its borders. The existence of an independent Inca ruler, even in a reduced mountain state, was politically inconvenient. Symbols matter. A surviving royal line can become a rallying point. A shrine can become a source of identity. A valley can become a memory that refuses to behave. The final campaign of 1572 was not just about territory. It was about ending a possibility. By capturing Tupac Amaru and dismantling the Vilcabamba state, the Spanish were trying to close the last official door through which Inca sovereignty could step back into history. But even then, they could not erase the deeper structures of Andean life. Sacred landscapes remained, Quechua language remained, agricultural knowledge remained, communities remained, memories remained, sometimes spoken openly, sometimes folded into new forms. The name Tupac Amaru itself would return centuries later in rebellions and political memory, proof that executed rulers do not always stay neatly in the past where empires would prefer to keep them. Yurac Rumi sits quietly inside this larger story. Its carved forms may look strange because we encounter them without the world that made them active. But once we place the stone in Vilcabamba, near Vitcos, in the shadow of the last Inca rulers, it begins to feel less like an isolated anomaly and more like a concentrated piece of history. Its surfaces hold the practical knowledge of stoneworkers, the religious importance of water and rock, the political needs of a court in refuge, and the violence of colonial religious conflict. That is a great deal for one stone to carry. No wonder it looks complicated. If a rock could look tired from historical responsibility, Yurac Rumi might be forgiven for requesting a quiet afternoon and a cup of tea. The lost world of Vilcabamba was never truly only one thing. It was royal and local, sacred and military, highland and forest edge, resistant and adaptive. It preserved older Inca traditions while also changing under the pressure of new realities. Its people were not symbols. They were human beings living through uncertainty with whatever tools, rituals, loyalties and strategies they had. The ruins that remain are only the hardest parts of that world. Stone survives better than voices. Terraces survive better than meals. Carved channels survive better than prayers. Archaeology gives us the bones of places, but the warmth of daily life has to be carefully imagined from the traces left behind. So when we stand again before Yurac Rumi in the mind, we should not see only a strange carved megalith. We should see messengers arriving dusty from difficult roads. We should see royal attendants and local communities moving through a ceremonial landscape. We should see water gathered from the mountain and guided through stone. We should see the memory of Cusco carried into exile, not as nostalgia alone, but as a working claim to legitimacy. We should see missionaries arriving with crosses and certainty, and Andean people defending a shrine whose meaning was not theirs to surrender. We should see a world that was shrinking politically, but still enormous in spiritual and cultural depth. And that may be why Yurac Rumi still feels so hard to explain. It was not made for a calm museum category. It was made, or at least used, in a world where survival and sacred order were bound together. Its shapes were not merely artistic choices. They were part of a landscape where the final Inca rulers tried to keep a damaged universe coherent. The white rock waited in the valley while history moved around it, with all the gentleness of a landslide. It saw power retreat, adapt, and fall. It saw rituals continue and then fade. It saw outsiders damage what they did not understand. Then it endured the long, slow return of moss, weather, and silence. But stone is stubborn. That is one of its finer qualities. It does not remember in the way people remember, but it preserves consequences. A cut surface remains after the hand is gone. A channel remains after the liquid offering has dried. A platform remains after the person who stood upon it has become a name in a chronicle, or no name at all. Vilcabamba's lost world has not returned, and it will not return, not in the form it once had. Yet in Yurac Rumi, something of its logic remains visible, not fully explained, not fully translated, but present enough to ask better questions. And once those questions begin, they lead naturally toward the labour behind the stone itself, toward the patient skill of people who could take mountain rock and turn it into ceremony, shaping not just surfaces, but the very relationship between human hands and the land beneath them. To imagine the making of Yurac Rumi, it helps to begin without the noise of modern machinery. No electric drill biting into the rock, no diamond saw winding through the valley, no crane lowering a neatly cut block into place while someone in a hard hat points helpfully at a clipboard. Instead, imagine a much quieter kind of work, slower and more physical, carried out in a landscape where stone was not an obstacle to be removed but a presence to be understood. The sound would have been sharper and more patient, hammerstone against rock, dust gathering on hands, voices passing instructions, water being brought, tools being checked, surfaces being tested again and again, not by machines that finish quickly, but by people who knew that stone gives way only when you are more stubborn than it is. This is one of the great misunderstandings about ancient stonework. When modern people see something carefully shaped, they often ask how it could have been done without modern tools, as though precision arrived suddenly with electricity and a hardware store. But human skill is older than metal engines. The Inca inherited and developed a long Andean tradition of working with stone, and they did so in a region where stone was everywhere. Underfoot, overhead, rising into mountains, breaking into cliffs, shaping valleys, and defining the routes by which people moved. To live in the Andes was to live in conversation with rock. You could not ignore it. You built with it, farmed around it, walked over it, worshipped beside it, and sometimes carved it until it became something both natural and deliberate. The Inca were not visitors to stone, they were specialists in its moods. Yurac Rumi was not a freestanding block hauled from a distant quarry and placed like a trophy in the valley. That matters. It was a natural outcrop, a living part of the ground carved in place. This changes the problem of making it. The workers did not have to move the whole stone, which is fortunate, because asking a large Andean rock to relocate politely is rarely successful. Instead, they had to read the outcrop as it already existed. They had to decide which parts should remain rough, which should be cut, which slopes could be transformed into plains, where channels might run, where ledges could be shaped, where a hollow might hold liquid or offerings, and where the natural body of the stone should still show through. The work was not simply carving, it was editing the mountain. That kind of work requires a different imagination from ordinary building. If you are making a wall, you can shape stones to fit a plan. If you're carving a natural outcrop into a shrine, the stone itself participates in the plan. Its size, cracks, grain, hardness, colour and position all matter. The worker cannot simply impose any design. He has to negotiate with what is there. A hidden fracture might ruin a surface. A stubborn ridge might require more pounding than expected. A natural curve might be preserved because it already suggests something useful or sacred. This is why carved bedrock shrines can feel so unusual. They are not purely designed objects, they are collaborations between human intention and geology. Though geology, being geology, tends to be the quieter and heavier partner. The tools available to Inca stoneworkers were not crude in the sense of careless. They were different, and different is not the same as primitive. Hard hammer stones could be used to pound and peck away at surfaces, removing small amounts of material over time. Stone tools harder than the rock being worked, or at least tough enough to abrade it effectively, could shape edges and flatten planes. Sand, water and repeated grinding could smooth surfaces. Wooden levers, ropes, ramps, and organised labour could move heavy stones when movement was necessary. Bronze tools existed in the Andes, though bronze is not ideal for cutting very hard stone in the way steel tools are. That does not mean stone could not be shaped. It means the process demanded patience, technique, and many careful impacts rather than one dramatic slice. Ancient craft was often less about forcing material quickly and more about wearing it down with persistence. In other words, the rock was not defeated in a single heroic moment. It was gradually persuaded, which is probably the safest way to argue with a boulder. There is something calming about that, if we let ourselves feel it. Modern life is full of instant results, or at least the promise of them. Press a button, receive an answer. Tap a screen, summon a map. Wait more than 6 seconds for a page to load and begin questioning civilization. But the making of a place like Yurac Rumi belonged to another tempo. A cut surface might represent hours, days, or weeks of work. A channel might require careful planning so that liquid moved the right way. A ledge might be adjusted repeatedly until it held the shape, height, and orientation required. The people making it may not have separated practical work from ritual purpose. The shaping itself may have been part of the shrine's life, not merely preparation for it. A sacred place could begin becoming sacred before it was finished. Across the Inca world, stonework showed this same combination of engineering and meaning. In Cusco, the famous walls demonstrate a nearly astonishing mastery of fitting irregular blocks so tightly that the joints seem drawn rather than built. At Sacsayhuaman, enormous stones lock together in massive zigzagging walls that still make visitors stare, usually with the expression of someone whose brain has briefly left to ask for help. At Machu Picchu, terraces, temples, stairways, and carved rock features blend into the ridge itself. The Inca did not build everywhere in the same style, and not every site received the same level of finish, but their best work reveals a deep knowledge of weight, stability, drainage, alignment, and visual presence. They were practical people in a difficult landscape, but they were also deeply symbolic builders. A wall could hold back earth and express order. A canal could move water and connect with ritual. A stone could be shaped for use and reverence at the same time. This combination is easy to miss when we focus only on the difficulty of carving. The technical question matters, but it is not the whole question. How did they cut the stone? With skill, labour, stone tools, abrasion, and time. How did they plan it? That is more difficult. What did each carved feature mean? More difficult still. The real achievement of Yurac Rumi may not be that surfaces were shaped without modern machinery. The real achievement is that a natural outcrop was transformed into a ceremonial place without losing its identity as part of the landscape. It was not turned into a smooth statue. It was not hidden inside a building. It remained rock, but rock made intentional. That is a subtle achievement, and subtle achievements are often the ones modern eyes take longest to notice. There is also a social side to this work. A carved shrine does not appear because one talented person woke up and thought, "Today I shall make the valley more mysterious." Large projects require organisation. Someone had to authorise the work. Someone had to understand the design. Workers had to be fed, directed, and perhaps ritually prepared. In the Inca world, labour was often organised through systems of obligation, including the mita, a form of rotational labour service owed to the state. This labour built roads, terraces, storehouses, temples, and other projects across the empire. It was not paid wage labour in the modern sense, but a system embedded in political and social relationships. To us, that may sound distant and bureaucratic, but on the ground it meant people moving earth, carrying stone, cutting channels, building walls, maintaining roads, and making the physical world of the state possible. Even in Vilcabamba, where the Inca state was reduced and under pressure, organised labour would have mattered. The last rulers could not command the resources of the old empire in the same way, but they still had authority over people, land, and ritual obligations. If Yurac Rumi was maintained or used as a royal shrine, its carving and care would have reflected that authority. The stone was not only a religious object. It was evidence that the Inca court could still gather skilled labour, still shape sacred space, still link itself to the land. In a time of political uncertainty, that ability was not decorative. It was survival made visible. The phrase, "moving mountains," can sound exaggerated, and in one sense it is. The Inca did not move mountains. Sensibly, they let the mountains remain where they were, because mountains are famously poor at cooperation. But they did something almost as impressive. They moved through mountains, built across mountains, farmed mountains, carved mountains, and turned mountain landscapes into organised worlds. Roads crossed high passes, stone steps climbed steep slopes, terraces transformed hillsides into fields, canals brought water where it was needed, storehouses waited at strategic points, messages moved quickly along royal roads by relay runners. The Inca state was, among other things, a system for making steep geography manageable. It did not flatten the Andes. It learned how to live with their difficulty. This is the broader world in which Yurac Rumi belongs. A carved rock shrine near a spring is not separate from the engineering of roads and terraces. It is part of the same relationship with terrain. The Inca did not see mountains merely as challenges to be conquered. Mountains were also sacred beings, sources of water, weather, fertility, danger, and identity. A road through a mountain pass was practical, yes, but the pass itself could have sacred associations. A terrace prevented erosion and grew food, but it also shaped the mountain into a form of human order. A canal carried water, but water was also life and offering. The practical and sacred were not two separate layers stacked awkwardly on top of each other. They were interwoven from the beginning. When thinking about the actual carving process at Yurac Rumi, it is helpful to picture stages rather than miracles. First, the outcrop had to be selected or recognised. Perhaps it already stood out because of its colour, size, shape, or relation to the spring. Then the desired features had to be planned, though the planning may not have looked like paper drawings. It may have lived in memory, in demonstration, in chords, markers, gestures, or the expertise of masterworkers. Rough shaping would remove larger irregularities. Pecking would define lines and surfaces. Grinding and abrasion would refine them. Channels might be tested with water to see how it moved. Edges could be corrected. Surfaces could be smoothed where needed and left rough where the natural stone was meant to remain. The results would not come all at once. It would emerge gradually, like a form being coaxed from the rock. This process also leaves room for change over time. It is possible that Yurac Rumi was not carved in a single campaign. Sacred places often evolve. A feature may be added, a surface may be reworked, a channel may be deepened, a damaged area may be repaired or adapted. A shrine's importance may grow, shift, or become connected with new political circumstances. In Vilcabamba, where the Inca court was trying to preserve legitimacy after conquest, older sacred places could have been renewed or modified. Without precise evidence for every phase, we should be cautious. But we should not imagine ancient monuments as frozen designs completed neatly on a Tuesday and then left unchanged forever. Human places are usually more complicated than that. Even modern kitchens accumulate strange modifications over time, and most kitchens do not have to carry the sacred authority of a royal lineage. One of the reasons people sometimes doubt ancient stoneworking methods is that they underestimate repetition. A single tap from a hammerstone seems unimpressive. 10 taps are still not much. 10,000 taps begin to change the conversation. Add many workers, skill direction, and time measured not in minutes but seasons, and the impossible becomes laborious rather than magical. This does not reduce the accomplishment. Laborious things can be magnificent. In fact, part of the wonder lies in the willingness to invest so much effort into shaping a place whose meaning was not merely practical. The stone embodies time. Every smoothed surface is a record of repeated action. Every carved line is a decision made durable. The same applies to moving large stones elsewhere in the Inca world. When blocks had to be transported, the process could involve quarrying, rough shaping, dragging, rolling over prepared surfaces, levering using ropes, and coordinating teams of workers. Llamas were useful pack animals, but they could not haul enormous building stones like oxen. The wheel, while known in principle in parts of the Americas in small objects, was not useful for large-scale transport in steep Andean terrain, without suitable roads for wheeled carts and large draft animals. So the Inca solved problems in ways suited to their landscape. They used human organization, rope, ramps, slopes, and careful planning. The fact that their methods differed from later European construction does not make their achievements less rational. It makes them more specifically Andean. At Yurac Rumi, the decision to carve the stone in place may have been both practical and meaningful. Practical because the outcrop was already there. Meaningful because a sacred rock connected to a spring could not simply be replaced by a transported block without losing something essential. If the stone's power came from its location, then moving it would have been like taking a fish on a long walk and wondering why it looks disappointed. The shrine's meaning may have depended on being exactly where it was. The spring, the valley, the nearby royal site, the surrounding slopes, and perhaps the view of certain mountains all formed part of its identity. In such a case, carving in place was not a limitation. It was the whole point. This is where modern language sometimes fails us. We might call Yurac Rumi a megalith, a carved rock, a shrine, a ritual platform, or an archaeological feature. Each term helps a little and misses a little. The people who used it may have understood it as a huaca, a sacred place, or being with presence and power. That concept does not map neatly onto modern categories. A huaca could be stone, spring, mountain, bummy, cave, or object. But it was not merely a thing. It was part of a relationship. It could receive offerings and give legitimacy. It could be cared for, feared, consulted, celebrated, or destroyed by those who opposed it. The carving of Yurac Rumi may have shaped not just stone, but a relationship between the Inca court and a powerful feature of the land. The work may also have involved specialists whose knowledge was not only technical. In a sacred setting, the person directing the carving might have needed to know ritual requirements as well as stone behavior. Where should water flow? Which surfaces should remain untouched? Which direction should a carved element face? Where should someone stand during an offering? What part of the rock should be most visible from the approach? These are not merely artistic questions. They are ceremonial design questions. They suggest that the making of Yurac Rumi involved coordination between craft, ritual knowledge, and political authority. A stoneworker could create a surface. A ritual specialist could define its use. A ruler could authorize the project. The valley could provide the setting. The spring could provide the movement. The result was not one person's artwork, but a social act made solid. There is a tendency in popular discussions to treat ancient monuments as puzzles waiting for a technological trick. What tool made this cut? How was that block moved? What secret method did they know? These are fair questions, but they can narrow our attention too much. A monument is not only a problem of technique, it is a problem of motivation. Why did people organize themselves to do this? Why here? Why in this shape? Why with this amount of effort? Modern construction usually begins with need. A bridge must cross a river, a house must shelter a family, a road must connect towns. Sacred construction begins with need too, but the need may be different. To honor a deity, legitimize a ruler, mark a seasonal event, maintain balance with the land, or preserve continuity in a fractured world. Yurac Rumi's strange shape may be less a mystery of tools than a mystery of needs we no longer fully share. Still, the tools deserve admiration. The patience of pecking stone into form is not glamorous in the usual sense. It does not produce sparks and roaring engines. It produces rhythm. A worker learns how the rock responds, where it chips, where it resists, how a surface can be made even by repeated blows. There is intelligence in the hand, not just in the head. Modern people sometimes speak of manual labour as though it is separate from thought, but skilled craft proves otherwise. The hand thinks through pressure, angle, timing and correction. The eye measures. The ear hears changes in impact. The body learns what the material will allow. The making of Yurac Rumi would have required that kind of knowledge, accumulated through practice and passed through communities of workers. It was not guesswork, it was tradition. The weather would also have been part of the process. Rain can reveal channels and drainage problems. Sunlight can expose uneven surfaces. Cold mornings and warm afternoons can change how workers experience the stone. In the Andes, the environment is never just background. It affects everything. Work schedules, visibility, water flow, travel, crops, ceremonies, and fatigue. A project in a mountain valley would need to respect the day's conditions. People working there would know when the light was best, when rain made work difficult, when paths became slippery, when water ran strongly, and when the valley grew quiet. Ancient construction did not happen outside nature. It happened inside it, with every inconvenience nature felt generous enough to provide. The finished stone, if finished is even the right word, would have presented a controlled surface within a living landscape. It may have gleamed differently when wet. It may have caught light at certain hours. It may have guided water across its cuts during ceremonies. People approaching it would not necessarily have admired the workmanship in the detached way visitors do now. They may have understood the features through use. That channel is where the liquid passes. That ledge is where the offering rests. That platform is where the officiant stands. That surface is not touched. That direction matters. Meaning would have been learned by participation. To us, the stone is an object of study. To them, it may have been a place of action. And this is why the work of carving cannot be separated from the work of believing. A purely practical canal has to carry water efficiently. A ritual channel has to carry water meaningfully. Sometimes it can do both. A practical seat has to be comfortable enough for a body. A ceremonial seat or platform has to mark a role, a status, or a moment. Comfort may be secondary. Anyone who has sat on an old stone bench for too long will understand that ancient dignity often came with numb legs. A practical staircase should help people go up or down. A symbolic staircase may guide the eye, represent ascent or frame movement without being used like an ordinary stair. At Yurac Rumi, what looks strange may simply be practical and symbolic purposes overlapping in ways we're no longer trained to read. It is also possible that some parts of the stone had meanings tied to Inca ideas of landscape reproduction. At several Andean sites, carved rocks appear to echo mountains, terraces, or built forms on a smaller scale. These miniature or abstracted landscapes may have allowed ritual specialists to interact with a larger geography through a concentrated form. If Yurac Rumi did something similar, then its carved ledges and plains might not be random at all. They might compress a landscape, a social order, or a sacred geography into the body of one rock. We should be cautious here, because not every carved surface is a map, and humans are very good at seeing patterns after bedtime. But the possibility fits with a broader Andean tendency to connect place, form, and ritual in ways that go beyond simple decoration. The phrase, moving mountains, then, becomes less about physical relocation and more about transformation. The Inca moved mountains by turning slopes into fields, ridges into roads, springs into shrines, and stones into active centres of ritual life. They took a difficult environment and made it organised without making it ordinary. Yurac Rumi is one example of that larger achievement. It shows how stone could be shaped while remaining part of the land, how engineering could serve ceremony, and how labour could make authority visible. It is not an impossible object. It is an intensely human one, created by people whose world gave them reasons to spend great effort on forms that still challenge us. By the time the carving was done, the white rock would not have been merely a rock with cuts in it. It would have been a prepared place. Its surfaces would have held the memory of labour even before ceremonies began. Its channels would have waited for water or offerings. Its ledges would have waited for objects, bodies, or gestures. Its pale mass would have stood beside the spring with new clarity, no longer just a feature of the valley but a focus within it. The mountain had not been moved away. It had been brought closer, shaped into a form people could approach. And perhaps that is the quiet genius of the place. Yurac Rumi does not show humans defeating stone. It shows humans entering into an agreement with it, one careful strike at a time. That agreement becomes even more important when we remember where the stone stood in history. In Vilcabamba, under the last Inca rulers, carving and maintaining sacred places was not simply a matter of tradition. It was a statement that the old relationship still existed. The spring still gave water, the rock still received form, the ruler still had ritual obligations. The people still gathered, the land still answered, or at least was asked to. In a world shaken by conquest, this kind of continuity mattered deeply. A carved shrine could help hold together what violence had tried to scatter. It could make visible the claim that Inca order was not finished, even if its capital had fallen. So when we look at Yurac Rumi and wonder how hands without modern tools could shape such a thing, we should also wonder what kind of world could make such work necessary. The answer lies not in secret machines, but in a society that understood stone as more than material, water as more than resource, and landscape as more than scenery. The white rock was carved by technique, yes, but also by obligation, memory and belief. And once we see that, the stone's strangeness begins to change. It is no longer strange because it seems beyond human ability. It is strange because it preserves a human ability we do not often practice anymore, the ability to treat a place as sacred enough to shape slowly, carefully, and with the full attention of a community. From here, the more we think about the stone, the less useful it becomes to treat it as a puzzle box waiting for the right hidden mechanism. A puzzle box is designed to be solved by someone clever. A sacred place is designed to be approached by someone prepared. That difference matters. Yurac Rumi may contain features we can study, measure and compare, but its deepest purpose was probably not to confuse future visitors. It was to gather meaning in a specific landscape for specific people, under specific historical pressures. The next step is not to force the stone into a theory that makes us feel clever before sleep. It is to ask what it meant for the people who came there when the spring was still part of ceremony, when the carved surfaces were still active, and when the white rock was not an archaeological mystery at all, but a sacred place with work to do. A puzzle box is made with one promise in mind. Somewhere inside it, behind sliding panels and hidden catches, there is an answer. Turn the right piece, press the right corner, notice the trick, and the object gives up its secret. This is a very satisfying idea, especially for modern minds trained by passwords, search bars, detective stories and kitchen drawers that only open if you lift them at exactly the right angle. But Yurac Rumi was almost certainly not made to behave like that. It was not a riddle waiting for a clever outsider to arrive centuries later, squint at the carvings, and announce that the whole thing was secretly a machine, a map, a code, or an ancient version of a very uncomfortable garden bench. It was a sacred place. And sacred places do not always hide answers. Sometimes they hold relationships. That may be the most important shift we can make when looking at the White Rock. We can still ask questions, of course. Questions are welcome here. They have removed their muddy boots and are sitting politely by the door. But the questions need to be the right kind. Instead of asking, what is the one hidden function? We might ask, who approached this place and why? Instead of asking, what secret technology does this prove? We might ask, what kind of world gave this stone its meaning? Instead of treating every groove as a clue in a treasure hunt, we can treat the whole setting as part of a ritual landscape, where stone, water, movement, authority, and memory work together. That does not make Yurac Rumi less mysterious. It makes the mystery more human. In the Andean world, sacredness was not limited to buildings with roofs or objects placed on altars. A stone could be sacred. A spring could be sacred. A mountain could be sacred. A cave, a mummy bundle, a carved outcrop, a place where lightning struck, a place where ancestors were remembered, or a place where water emerged from the ground could all carry power. The Quechua word often used for such sacred places or beings is huasa. This is a small word for a very large idea. A huaca was not simply a religious decoration. It could be a presence in the world, something connected to community identity, local history, fertility, political authority, and the living landscape. It could receive offerings. It could be addressed, honoured, feared, cared for, and sometimes attacked by people who wanted to weaken the traditions connected to it. Yurac Rumi fits much more comfortably into that world than into the world of puzzle boxes. It stands near water. It is carved into the living rock of the valley. It is located close to Vitcos, a site connected to the last Inca rulers in Vilcabamba. It bears signs of deliberate shaping that seem to organise the stone for more than casual use. These facts do not give us a perfect instruction manual, but they do point us away from randomness. The White Rock was not just noticed because it looked odd, it was shaped because it mattered. And in a sacred landscape, mattering is not a vague feeling, it is a social fact. People make paths to places that matter. They build near them, they bring offerings, they tell stories, they return. It is worth pausing on that word, return. A sacred place becomes powerful not only because of what it is, but because people keep coming back to it. A spring becomes part of memory because generations draw from it, speak of it, mark seasons beside it, or connect it with origin stories and obligations. A mountain becomes more than a high piece of earth because people look to it for weather, protection, danger, and identity. A carved stone becomes more than work material because people approach it in prescribed ways. The meaning is renewed by repetition. Without repetition, even the most carefully carved object can become mute. This may be part of what happened to Yurac Rumi. The stone remains, but the returning ceremonies that once made it fully legible have faded, changed, or been interrupted. We are left looking at the stage after the actors, music, offerings, and audience have gone. That does not mean the stage tells us nothing. It tells us a great deal if we do not ask it to tell us everything at once. The placement of Yurac Rumi tells us that its connection to water was probably important. The surrounding ruins tell us that this was an organised space. The carving tells us that skilled labour was invested here. The historical setting tells us that the shrine belonged to a region of intense political and religious importance during the final decades of independent Inca rule. And the later colonial hostility towards such shrines tells us that sacred stones were not harmless curiosities in the eyes of Spanish missionaries. They were active rivals in a contest over meaning. A puzzle box may frustrate the mind. A sacred place can threaten an empire's preferred version of reality. The Spanish campaign against Andean religious practices was not only about theology and the quiet sense of belief, it was also about power. To convert a population, colonial authorities needed to weaken the old connections between people, ancestors, land, and sacred beings. A shrine like Yurac Rumi could support those connections simply by continuing to be visited and honoured. It reminded people that the sacred world had not begun with the arrival of European priests. It tied legitimacy to mountains, water, and Inca authority, rather than to the colonial church. So when missionaries attacked sacred places, they were not merely disagreeing with local ideas. They were trying to break a network of relationships. This is why the damage done to a shrine is part of its history. Violence towards sacred stone is not just violence towards stone, it is violence toward the community that recognizes it. Yet the stone endures, and endurance can be quietly powerful. Yurac Rumi has survived the disappearance of the ceremonies that once animated it, the fall of the Vilcabamba state, colonial disruption, weathering, rediscovery, tourism, photography, speculation, and probably more confident theories than it ever asked for. It sits there still, which is something stone is very good at doing, but it does not sit as a defeated object. It sits as evidence that sacred landscapes are harder to erase than official campaigns imagine. Even when names shift and rituals change, places can continue to draw attention. People still feel that something happened there. They may not know exactly what, but they can sense that the stone is not ordinary. In that sense, the White Rock has retained some of its ability to gather people, even if the reasons for gathering have changed. Modern visitors often arrive with cameras, and cameras encourage a certain kind of looking. They frame, isolate, and collect. A photograph can make Yurac Rumi seem like an object to be captured from the best angle. This is understandable. The stone is visually striking, and humans have been showing each other interesting rocks for a very long time, though the technology has improved from pointing and saying "look" to uploading 12 images with dramatic captions. But sacred places are not always best understood through isolated views. They are experienced by moving through them. You approach, turn, notice water, see how the rock sits in relation to the slope, feel the enclosure of the valley, and gradually understand that the stone is not separate from its surroundings. The shrine is not only the carved mass. It is the place formed by rock, spring, path, nearby structures, and the memory of human action. This matters because sacred landscapes often work through orientation. Where do you come from? What do you face? What is visible from a certain point? Where does water begin and where does it go? Which part of the stone is approached first? Which parts are elevated, hidden, or set apart? We cannot reconstruct every movement at Yurac Rumi, but the presence of carved surfaces suggests that movement and placement mattered. A ritual specialist may have stood in one position. Offerings may have been placed in another. Water or chicha may have been poured along a channel. Observers may have gathered at a distance, close enough to witness but not close enough to touch. Rank, age, gender, lineage, office, and ritual role could all have shaped who did what. A sacred place is often a map of relationships acted out by bodies. This is why the question "what was it for" is both useful and too small. A modern object often has one main purpose. A kettle boils water, a chair holds a sitter, a clock measures time and occasionally judges us. Yurac Rumi may have had many purposes because ritual itself has many purposes. It could honour water, it could connect the ruler with sacred forces, it could receive offerings, it could mark seasonal events, it could serve as a place of purification, it could preserve a relationship with a local huaca, It could demonstrate continuity with Inca sacred traditions in a time when Spanish power threatened that continuity. None of these possibilities cancel the others. In a ceremonial setting, they may have strengthened one another. The Inca world was full of such overlapping meanings. Roads were not only roads, they moved armies, messengers, goods, and officials, but they also tied the empire into a visible network of authority. Terraces were not only fields. They fed people, stabilized slopes, and displayed the state's power to organize mountain terrain. Storehouses were not only storage buildings, they represented planning, surplus, obligation, and control. Stone walls were not only walls, they showed skill, permanence, and order. In the same way, Yurac Rumi was not only a carved rock, it was a place where many kinds of meaning could meet without politely forming a queue. The relationship between sacredness and practicality can be difficult for us, because modern culture often separates them. We may think of religion as belief, engineering as function, art as beauty, politics as power, and nature as scenery. In the Inca world, those divisions were not so firm. A water channel could be useful and sacred, a royal ritual could be political and religious, a stone could be a natural feature and a worked monument, a mountain could be geography and a living power. Once we accept this, Yurac Rumi becomes less baffling. Its refusal to fit one category is not a flaw. It's exactly what we should expect from a place where categories overlapped. Still, calling the stone sacred should not become a lazy answer either. Sometimes people use the word ritual when they do not know what else to say, rather like putting an object in a drawer labelled mysterious ancient behaviour and then going off for a biscuit. We should do better than that. To say Yurac Rumi was sacred is not to stop asking questions. It is to ask more specific ones. What role did water play here? Was the shrine tied to royal ceremonies from Vitcos? Did it relate to local mountain beings or ancestor veneration? Were its carvings used to guide offerings? Did its pale colour matter? Was access restricted? Did ceremonies occur at particular times of year? Did the stone surfaces interact with sunlight, shadow, or the flow of spring water? These questions are not solved by the word sacred, but they are made possible by it. The shrine's connection to Inca rulership is especially important. In Vilcabamba, the last Inca rulers were not merely surviving physically, they were preserving a claim. A ruler without ritual legitimacy becomes just a man with followers and a difficult address. Inca kingship depended on sacred ancestry, cosmic order, and connection to powerful places. The empire had once centered its ritual world around Cusco, with sacred lines, temples, ancestors, and state ceremonies arranged around the capital. After Cusco fell under Spanish control, the rulers in Vilcabamba needed ways to continue performing authority in a new setting. Sacred sites near their court could help do that. Yurac Rumi may have been one of the places where that continuity was made visible. This gives the stone a more urgent character. It was not simply part of an old tradition continuing peacefully from one generation to the next. It stood in a world under stress. The Spanish presence had disrupted politics, religion, trade, warfare, and daily life. The Inca rulers in Vilcabamba had to negotiate with missionaries and colonial officials while maintaining their own authority among Andean communities. In that setting, a shrine was not a quiet luxury. It was part of cultural survival. To perform rituals at a sacred rock beside a spring was to say that the old relationships had not been severed. The mountain still mattered. The water still mattered. The ruler still had obligations. The people still belonged to a world deeper than conquest. And perhaps this is why the stone became a target. Spanish missionaries understood, in their own way, that sacred places anchored belief. They may not have respected the shrine's meaning, but they recognized that it held meaning. When they tried to damage or destroy such places, they were trying to interrupt the cycle of return. No shrine, no offerings. No offerings, no relationship. No relationship, no old authority, or so the logic went. But sacred landscapes are not always so easily dismantled. A damaged stone can still be remembered. A forbidden place can still be visited quietly. A Christian image can be placed near an older site, and meanings can blend, hide, or continue beneath new names. The colonial world was full of such complicated mixtures. Human belief is rarely as obedient as officials would like. This does not mean we should romanticize everything. Sacred places are human places, and human places contain hierarchy, control, exclusion and politics as well as reverence. Not everyone may have had equal access to Yurac Rumi. Some people may have worked to maintain it without being allowed to perform the central rituals. Some may have experienced the shrine as a source of communal identity, while others experienced it through obligations imposed by rulers. Inca religion, like Inca administration, was powerful and organized. The sacred can comfort, but it can also command. Remembering this keeps the past from becoming too soft around the edges. A shrine is not just a pretty place with incense and sunlight. It is a place where power is arranged. That arrangement may be written into the stone's very form. Elevated surfaces can establish importance. Channels can control movement. Restricted spaces can separate participants from observers. A central rock can focus attention. Nearby buildings can house attendants, offerings, or ritual specialists. A spring can provide the necessary element around which action unfolds. The whole space may have directed people without needing written instructions. Architecture is very good at telling bodies what to do. A doorway says, "Enter here." A wall says, "Not there." A platform says, "Look up." A narrow path says, "Come one at a time, and please do not bring a llama unless absolutely necessary." Sacred architecture adds another layer by making those movements meaningful. Yurac Rumi's unusual carvings may have shaped such movement. What looks from a photograph like a confusing arrangement of cuts may, in use, have been a clear sequence. A person approaches from one side, water is taken from the spring, an offering is placed, liquid is poured. It follows a groove. Someone speaks, sings, prays, or remains silent. Observers watch the water cross the stone. The surface darkens. The action links human intention with the flow emerging from the earth. We do not know if this exact sequence occurred, and we should not pretend we do. But imagining ritual action helps us understand why still features can seem strange when separated from use. A musical instrument lying silent on a table can look like oddly shaped wood. Its purpose becomes clearer when someone plays it. There's also the question of memory. Sacred places often hold stories of origin, ancestry, or past events. The Inca and other Andean peoples preserved history through oral tradition, ceremony, textiles, quipu records, and landscape itself. A carved stone near a royal refuge may have helped tie the present to remembered authority. In a period after conquest, memory would have been especially important. When political centres are lost, people often hold more tightly to places and practices that confirm who they are. Yurac Rumi may have helped carry that burden. It may have been a place where the Inca court remembered itself, not sentimentally, but ritually. The stone's silence today can make that hard to grasp. Modern ruins often seem peaceful because the conflicts that shape them are gone. Grass grows over walls, birds perch on stones, visitors whisper or take photographs. The quiet can fool us into thinking the past itself was quiet. But Yurac Rumi's history was not quiet. It stood near a court in exile. It was connected to sacred practice during a period of negotiation and violence. It was reportedly attacked by missionaries. It survived the final destruction of independent Inca rule in Vilcabamba. Its calm today is the calm of something that has outlasted noise, not the calm of something that was never disturbed. This is one reason the puzzle box approach can feel too shallow. A puzzle box exists outside suffering. It is clever, contained, and solved by technique. Yurac Rumi exists inside history. Its meaning is tied to people whose world was being transformed by conquest. It carries the memory of ritual continuity and religious conflict. It asks us not only to admire ancient skill, but to consider what happens when sacred relationships are targeted by a new regime. That is a heavier question than how a groove was carved. It is also more respectful to the people who made and used the site. At the same time, we do not need to drain the wonder from the stone by becoming overly cautious. Wonder is allowed. In fact, wonder is useful when it slows us down rather than making us leap wildly. It is perfectly reasonable to look at Yurac Rumi and feel that it is extraordinary. It is extraordinary. The problem begins only when wonder turns into refusal to credit ancient people with their own achievements. The Inca did not need aliens, lost lasers, or secret concrete printers disguised as priests. They had knowledge, labour, time, and reasons. Those reasons were not small. They were rooted in a sacred geography where stone and water could carry political and spiritual force. The true wonder is that this world produced a place so layered that we are still working to understand it. Thinking of Yurac Rumi as a sacred place also changes how we listen to its uncertainty. We do not have to fill every gap with speculation. Some gaps can remain open. Sacred places often protect part of themselves simply because their meanings were never meant to be detached from practice. Without the original rituals, full certainty may be impossible. That is not failure. It is a boundary. Archaeology can bring us close, sometimes very close, but it cannot resurrect every gesture, every word, every rule of access, every emotion felt by someone approaching the spring at dawn. The past is generous, but not endlessly so. It gives stone, broken walls, colonial accounts, local memory, comparative patterns, and traces in the landscape. It does not always give the private feeling of being there when the place was alive. And yet, enough remains to guide us. We know that the Inca treated landscape as meaningful. We know that huasas were central to Andean religious life. We know that water sources could be sacred. We know that Vilcabamba was the last centre of Inca resistance. We know that Yurac Rumi's carved surfaces and setting indicate deliberate ceremonial importance. From these pieces we can build an understanding that is careful without being empty. The White Rock was not nonsense. It was not an accident. It was not a random art project. It was a sacred place integrated into a political and ritual landscape at a crucial moment in Andean history. This careful understanding has its own quiet beauty. It asks us to be less like conquerors of mystery and more like guests. A guest does not barge into someone's home, open every drawer, and declare the furniture confusing. A good guest notices the arrangement, asks gently, listens when possible, and accepts that some things may not be theirs to rearrange. When we look at Yurac Rumi this way, the stone becomes less defensive. Its strangeness becomes a sign of cultural depth rather than a challenge to be defeated. We can stand before it and say, I do not fully understand you, without needing to add, therefore you must be impossible. That is a small but important act of respect. There is also a lesson here about how we treat ancient places more broadly. The modern world often turns ruins into content, mysteries into entertainment, and sacred sites into backdrops. A carved stone becomes a thumbnail, a temple becomes a travel goal, a burial place becomes a dramatic opening shot. Curiosity is not the problem. Curiosity is good. It brought us here after all, wearing comfortable shoes and trying not to mispronounce Quechua words too badly. The problem is curiosity without humility. Yurac Rumi asks for both. The desire to know and the willingness to admit that knowing has limits. Once we accept those limits, the site becomes richer rather than poorer. The carved channels invite us to think about water. The spring invites us to think about emergence from the earth. The nearby ruins invite us to think about royal presence and ceremony. The colonial accounts invite us to think about religious conflict. The stone survival invites us to think about memory. Each feature opens outward into a larger world. A puzzle box narrows toward one solution. A sacred place expands toward many relationships. This is why Yurac Rumi continues to matter. It does not give us a single answer. It teaches us how to ask wider questions. And one of those questions concerns the natural forces that may have made the shrine active. Not hidden gears, not secret engines, but ordinary forces treated with extraordinary attention. Sunlight crossing stone, water moving through carved lines, shadows shifting over ledges, seasonal changes altering the valley, a spring flowing from the mountain with a steadiness that outlasted rulers and empires. To modern eyes, these may seem like background conditions. To the people who shaped and used Yurac Rumi, they may have been central. The sacred does not always require spectacle. Sometimes it begins with noticing that water comes from the earth, that stone catches the sun, and that a valley can gather silence around a ritual until every small movement matters. From there, the white rock starts to look less like a locked object and more like a place designed to bring the sun, the water, and the silent geometry of the land into the same careful field of attention. The first things to imagine at Yurac Rumi are not hidden mechanisms or secret compartments, but sunlight and water. They are ordinary enough that the mind can overlook them. Sunlight falls on every stone, and water runs wherever gravity persuades it to go. Yet in the Andes, and especially in the Inca world, these were not background details. They were among the main actors. A carved shrine beside a spring in a mountain valley near a royal refuge does not need a complicated machine inside it to become powerful. The landscape already provides movement. The sun moves across the sky, shadows move across the stone, water emerges from the earth, flows, gathers, spills and disappears. People arrive, place offerings, watch, speak and leave. The geometry of the place may be silent now, but it was never empty. When we look at Yurac Rumi through this lens, its odd carved surfaces begin to feel less like isolated shapes and more like devices for directing attention. Not devices in the modern sense with gears and wires, but arrangements of stone that guide the eye, the body, and possibly the movement of liquid. A flat surface is not just flat. It creates a place where something can rest or where light can land clearly. A channel is not just a cut. It creates a path. A raised edge is not just an edge. It separates one area from another. A hollow can collect water or offerings. A ledge can mark a level. These are simple features, but sacred places often work through simple features used with care. A stone does not need to be complicated to organize human behavior. A doorway is only an opening in a wall, and yet everyone knows what to do when they see one. The Inca was skilled at organizing experience through space. Their buildings, plazas, terraces, roads, and shrines were not randomly arranged. They paid attention to slopes, views, water flow, access, and the relationship between built forms and natural features. At Machu Picchu, for example, architecture is bound tightly to the ridge. At Cusco, walls and sacred places were part of a larger ritual geography. In many Inca sites, carved bedrock, water channels, and carefully framed views suggest that the landscape itself was treated as part of the design. Yurac Rumi belongs to this broader habit of thought. It is not a sculpture pulled away from its setting, it is a prepared part of the valley. Water is the easiest place to begin because it is physically present. The spring near Yurac Rumi would have made the site active in a way a dry stone could not be. Springs are naturally compelling. Even today, if you come across water emerging from the ground, it feels slightly special. You know there are underground routes you cannot see. Rain has fallen somewhere above, seeped into soil and cracks, moved through hidden layers, and then returned to the surface at one precise place. In a mountain landscape, this is more than convenient. It is life. Crops, animals, people, and settlements depend on water being where it is needed. To mark a spring with stonework is a practical act, but also a recognition that this point in the land matters. For the Inca and other Andean peoples, water was closely tied to fertility and order. It flowed from mountains, fed fields, and linked high places to valleys. A spring could be associated with origin, cleansing, or communication with forces below the earth. Offerings of liquid, including water or chicha, were important in many Andean ritual contexts. When liquid is poured, it does something visible. It changes the colour of stone. It follows a chosen path if a channel is provided. It can be divided, gathered, spilled, or directed toward the ground. A carved line becomes meaningful when something moves along it. Without water, a channel is only a mark. With water, it becomes an action. This may help explain some of Yurac Rumi's carved geometry. We should be careful not to claim that every groove has been fully understood, because that would be too confident. But it is reasonable to think that at least some shaped features were connected to the movement, display, or control of liquid. A ritual specialist could pour from a vessel and allow the liquid to travel along a prepared route. Observers could watch it pass through the stone. The movement might represent flow from the mountain, blessing from a sacred source, connection between levels, or the offering returning to the earth. The physical action would have carried the meaning. The stone was not simply looked at, it was used. Sunlight adds another layer. In a mountain valley, light is not the same throughout the day. Ridges control when the sun appears and disappears. Morning can arrive late in shadowed places. Afternoon can leave quickly behind a slope. A carved surface may be bright for a short period and then dark for hours. Edges create shadows that sharpen or soften depending on the sun's angle. At certain times of year, the sun's path shifts enough to change which parts of a site are illuminated. In cultures that tracked solar cycles for agriculture, ritual and state ceremony, these changes could matter. The Inca paid close attention to the sun. Their rulers traced descent from the solar deity Inti, and solar observation was important in Cusco and other ceremonial centres. This does not mean every carved stone is an astronomical instrument, but it does mean light was part of the world they designed within. At Yurac Rumi, sunlight may have helped animate the carved forms. A flat plane facing a certain direction might catch light in a specific way. A notch or edge might cast a shadow that marks time of day or season, or simply creates visual emphasis during ritual. A pale stone, especially one known as the white rock, would respond visibly to changing light. In bright sun, it might stand out strongly against the green and brown valley. Under cloud, it might appear softer and less defined. After rain, wet surfaces could darken, and water in grooves could glint. These changes are small, but ritual attention often gives small changes importance. A shadow arriving at the right moment can feel like confirmation. A surface lighting up during a ceremony can direct every eye at once. We do not need to imagine the Inca thinking about geometry in the same way a modern engineer or surveyor might. They did not need printed diagrams with measurements and neat labels. Geometry can be practical knowledge. Farmers know the slope of a field by working it. Builders know level and angle by eye, chord, plumb, and experience. Stoneworkers know how surfaces meet because their hands and tools test the material. Ritual specialists know where people should stand and what should be visible. The silent geometry of Yurac Rumi may have been a geometry of use, lines of approach, levels of access, paths of water, areas of light, positions for offerings, and relationships between the rock and the surrounding land. The word silent is useful here because the stone no longer tells us its rules directly. There are no surviving instructions carved beside it, saying that the water was poured at dawn, or that one ledge was reserved for a particular offering, or that a shadow mattered on a particular day. If such rules existed, they were likely carried in practice and memory, not on a signboard. Ritual knowledge is often taught by participation. A young attendant watches where the vessel is placed. A priest learns the sequence of gestures. A noble understands where to stand because status has its own choreography. Over time, the rules become natural to the people inside the tradition. Centuries later, outsiders look at the same stone and wonder why the steps do not behave like steps. Some of the carved features may have organised rank. Sacred places often separate ordinary access from special access. This does not require high walls. A change in level can be enough. A raised platform suggests importance. A narrow approach controls movement. A carved seat, if that is what a feature was, may not be for comfort but for authority. A basin may not be a container in the domestic sense, but a place where an offering is transformed by contact with stone and water. If rulers or ritual specialists used Yurac Rumi, the stone could have made social order visible. Those allowed near the central surfaces would be distinguished from those who watched. The arrangement of bodies around the rock would become part of the meaning. This is where geometry becomes social. A line cut into stone can direct liquid, but it can also define a relationship. This area is above that one. This path leads here but not there. This surface faces the spring. This ledge is visible from the gathering place. These are not abstract facts. They shape what people do. Architecture, even very simple architecture, is a way of arranging behaviour. Yurac Rumi may not have walls and rooms in the usual sense, but it still arranges attention. It tells the visitor that some parts matter more than others. It slows the eye, directs movement, and makes the natural outcrop into a controlled ceremonial focus. The surrounding landscape would have extended that arrangement. The valley is not a blank background. The approach to the site, the nearby ruins, the spring, the slopes, and possibly views toward particular hills or mountains, all formed part of the experience. Andean sacred geography often connected local shrines with larger features, especially mountains. Mountains were not just high landforms. They could be powerful beings associated with water, weather, fertility, and protection. A shrine at a spring may have been understood in relation to the mountain system feeding that water. A carved rock could concentrate a broader landscape into one accessible place. By working the stone, people may have created a point where human ritual could engage forces too large to approach directly. If we think of Yurac Rumi as a meeting point, its strangeness becomes easier to accept. It may have brought together the spring below, the sun above, the mountain around it, and the Inca court nearby. The carvings did not have to depict these things realistically. They only had to structure contact. A channel could make water visible. A platform could make authority visible. A pale surface could make sunlight visible. A carved outcrop could make the mountain's presence available at human scale. This is not a puzzle in the sense of a hidden answer. It's a place where several visible forces are brought into order. There may also have been seasonal meaning. In agricultural societies, tracking time through environmental changes is essential. The Inca state organised farming, labour, festivals and storage across varied ecological zones, and solar cycles played a role in ritual calendars. In a valley setting, the position of sunrise or sunset along ridges may have been observed. Shadows may have indicated periods of the year. Water flow itself changes with season, depending on rainfall and mountain conditions. A shrine that involved both sun and water could have been tied to agricultural timing, fertility rites, or ceremonies of renewal. Again, we should not claim more than the evidence allows, but it is reasonable to see the potential for seasonal attention at a place where a spring, carved stone, and royal ritual landscape meet. The Inca were not alone in this. Across the world, ancient peoples used light and water to make sacred spaces active. Egyptian temples could be aligned with solar events. Greek sanctuaries often centered on springs, caves, or unusual landforms. Mesoamerican cities incorporated astronomical observation into architecture. Medieval churches used light through windows to shape religious experience. The details differ greatly, and we should not blur them together into one vague global ancient mystery. But the broader human pattern is clear. People pay attention to recurring natural events, and they build meaning around them. The sun returns, water flows, seasons change. A sacred place gives those repetitions a location. Yurac Rumi's geometry may therefore have worked with repetition. A ceremony performed once can be powerful. A ceremony performed again and again, at the right time, in the right place, by the right people, becomes part of social order. The carved stone would help maintain that order because it stays. Human bodies age, rulers die, political situations change, but the stone remains ready to receive the next action. A channel cut into rock does not forget the path. A platform does not forget where it stands. In a period of instability like Vilcabamba, this permanence would have mattered. The world outside could change rapidly, but the shrine could preserve a sequence of actions that made continuity feel real. This is especially important when thinking about the last Inca rulers. Vilcabamba was a reduced state, but it was not a meaningless remnant. Its rulers needed to demonstrate that the sacred order still functioned. A site like Yurac Rumi could support that demonstration through visible ceremony. Water could still be offered or guided. The sun could still mark the day. The stone could still hold the form given by Inca hands. The ruler or ritual specialist could still perform the proper actions. In a world where Spanish power claimed a new order, these acts would have said, quietly but firmly, that another order still existed. The Spanish missionaries who attacked Andean shrines often understood the danger of these repeated acts. It was not enough from their perspective for people to say they had accepted Christianity if they continued to honour old sacred places. A spring shrine could keep older relationships alive. A carved stone could preserve a pattern of return. A ritual involving water and rock could maintain belief without needing written doctrine. This is why sacred landscapes were so difficult for colonial authorities to control. You can build a church, but you cannot make a mountain stop being a mountain. You can preach against a spring, but the water still comes out of the ground. You can damage a stone, but the memory of why it mattered may remain. The geometry of Yurac Rumi is silent now, partly because the colonial disruption was successful in many practical ways. The old ceremonies did not continue publicly in their original form. The court of Vilcabamba ended. The shrine lost the social world that explained it. But the geometry is not meaningless. It still shows that people made careful choices. They did not merely decorate the rock. They prepared surfaces, created levels, and shaped roots across the stone. The arrangement suggests that the shrine was meant to be engaged in a controlled way. Even without knowing every action, we can see that the stone organised something. One helpful comparison is a dry fountain in an old plaza. If you find it centuries after the water has stopped, the channels, basin and spillways may still show how water once moved. You might not know the exact ceremony held there, or who gathered around it, or what songs were sung, but the form tells you that movement mattered. Yurac Rumi may be similar, though more sacred and complex. Its water-related features are not simply dead marks. They are evidence of motion that has paused. The shrine is like a sentence with the verbs missing. The nouns remain: stone, spring, ledge, channel, platform, valley. The actions must be reconstructed carefully. Light is harder to reconstruct because it leaves no permanent trace unless a feature was clearly aligned with an observed event. Still, light affects how a site is experienced every day. The Inca did not need to build an exact solar calendar into every shrine for sunlight to matter. A ceremony held at morning, noon, or late afternoon would look different because the stone would look different. Shadows could create divisions, bright surfaces could draw focus. The surrounding ridges could make the arrival of sunlight dramatic, not because of theatrical design, but because mountain landscapes naturally control light. Anyone who has watched sunlight finally enter a cold valley knows that the event has a physical effect. It warms, reveals, and changes mood. Ancient people noticed such things because their lives were closer to them than ours often are. The pale colour of the rock may have increased this effect. A white or light-coloured stone is visually responsive. It can glow in sunlight and stand out in shade. It can look clean, exposed, or set apart. It may have been named for that quality because it was the obvious thing people saw. Whether whiteness carried a specific ritual meaning at Yurac Rumi is harder to say, but visually it matters. The white rock would not have blended quietly into the valley. It would have caught attention. especially if water darkened some surfaces while others remained dry. A ceremony involving liquid on pale stone could produce visible contrast. The action would not be hidden, it would be seen. This visibility matters because ritual often needs witnesses. Not every sacred act is public, but many forms of political ritual depend on being seen. A ruler's connection to sacred forces has more social power when people witness it. A shrine near Vitcos could have served as a place where royal authority was displayed through correct action. The stone, water, and light would help make that display convincing. The ruler does not merely claim legitimacy, he stands in the right place, beside the right spring, at the right stone, under the same sun that watched over earlier rulers, and performs actions that place him within continuity. The geometry of the shrine supports the statement without a single written word. This is one reason the site should not be reduced to decoration. Its forms were likely part of a system of communication. Not communication through alphabetic text, but through placement, action, material, and repetition. A modern person may miss this because we are so used to word carrying official meaning. We expect plaques, documents, diagrams, titles, and explanations. The Inca world used other media as well. Quipu cords, textiles, oral performance, architecture, roads, and landscape. A carved rock could communicate through use. It could say, in stone and water, that a relationship existed. It could be understood by people trained within that world without needing a caption. Of course, we should also allow for ordinary maintenance. Sacred does not mean impractical. If water flowed through the site, channels may have needed cleaning. If people gathered there, paths had to be maintained. If offerings were made, remains had to be managed. Buildings nearby may have housed attendants or stored ritual materials. The sacred landscape was also a working landscape. Someone had to look after it. Someone had to notice when a channel clogged with leaves or sediment. Someone had to bring vessels, prepare offerings, and keep access clear. Ancient ceremony often required ordinary labour behind the scenes. Every impressive ritual has someone worrying about logistics, even if history rarely remembers their name. Somewhere in the background of many sacred events, there is probably a tired person thinking, who was supposed to bring the bowl? That ordinary labour makes the site more real. Yurac Rumi was not just an idea. It was a place people maintained with their bodies. They walked there, carried things, repaired features, cleaned water routes, and prepared for events. The silent geometry was kept legible through work. When the work stopped, nature began to soften the lines. Weather-rounded edges, plants grew, sediment gathered, damage from colonial hostility in later centuries altered what remained. Today we see both design and decay. That combination can make interpretation difficult, because a feature may be partly original, partly weathered, partly damaged, and partly misunderstood by modern eyes. The stone is not a frozen photograph from the 16th century. It is an object with a long afterlife. Still, enough remains for us to sense the original discipline of the place. Yurac Rumi was arranged, not random. Its carved forms are too deliberate to be accidental, but too tied to natural rock to be ordinary architecture. The spring gives movement, the sun gives changing visibility, the valley gives enclosure. The nearby Inca remains give political and historical context. Together these elements form a quiet system. It does not shout its meaning. It does not need to. The people who used it likely knew what each movement meant. The stone's job was not to explain itself to strangers. Its job was to participate. This is why the phrase silent geometry fits better than secret code. A code is meant to be cracked. Geometry is meant to hold relationships. At Yurac Rumi, the relationships may have included upper and lower, wet and dry, bright and shadowed, rough and worked, natural and shaped, human and mountain, ruler and sacred source. These pairs are not abstract when they are built into a real place. You can see them, move through them, and use them. The stone makes them tangible. That may be the deepest function of its design. It turns relationships into surfaces. As we follow these surfaces in the mind, we begin to understand why Yurac Rumi still unsettles people. It does not look like something made for a single purpose, because it probably was not. It looks like something made to hold a set of relationships that were obvious to its users and unclear to us. This does not make it impossible. It makes it historically dense. And the denser the history, the more careful we must be. Each carved line may tempt us into certainty, but the better response is patient attention. The sun, the water and the stone can tell us quite a lot, but they do not tell us everything. Some parts of the shrine's meaning may be recoverable only as possibilities, some may remain beyond reach. And that is where the fascination deepens again. Because even after considering water, light, ritual movement, royal authority, seasonal attention, and sacred geography, Yurac Rumi still does not become simple. It becomes more understandable, but not fully explained. The white rock continues to hold back certain details. It lets us see the outline of a system, but not every rule. It lets us imagine ceremonies, but not hear the words. It lets us follow channels, but not know every offering poured through them. It lets us place the shrine within Vilcabamba, but not recover every memory carried by the people who came there. The sun has moved over it for centuries. The water has kept its own patient route. The stone remains in its valley, shaped by human hands and natural forces together, and the more clearly we see that partnership, the more we are drawn toward the questions that still wait in the pale surfaces, the things Yurac Rumi continues to refuse to tell us outright. The most honest thing we can say about Yurac Rumi is that it gives us enough to follow, but not enough to finish. It is not blank. It is not meaningless. It does not sit in the valley like a stone with no story attached. Its carved surfaces, its spring, its position near Vitcos, its connection to the final Inca world of Vilcabamba, and the historical memory of its importance all speak clearly enough to tell us that this was a sacred place. But when we ask for the exact details, the precise sequence of rituals, the names of the people who stood there, the dates when ceremonies were performed, the offerings placed on each ledge, the words spoken beside the water, the stone grows quiet. Not silent in the sense of empty, silent in the sense of withholding. Like an old witness who remembers everything but has decided that not every answer belongs to us. This is where Yurac Rumi becomes most interesting, because mystery is not always the absence of information. Sometimes mystery is what remains after the obvious explanations have done their best and stepped politely aside. We can say that Inca stoneworkers shaped the rock. We can say that the spring mattered. We can say that the shrine belonged to a sacred landscape connected with late Inca power. We can say that water, light, movement and ceremony probably work together there. These are not small statements. They already bring the white rock out of the fog. But they do not tell us everything. They do not tell us why one surface was carved at that exact angle and not another. They do not tell us whether a particular channel carried spring water, chicha, blood, or some other offering. They do not tell us whether the stone was used daily, seasonally, only on special occasions, or only by certain people. The shape remains, but the instructions are gone, and perhaps the instructions were never written in the first place. That is one of the difficulties of studying Inca sacred places. The Inca did have systems of record keeping, most famously quipu, those intricate arrangements of chords and knots that could preserve numerical information, and perhaps much more. They had oral histories, trained memory specialists, ritual specialists, and official traditions. But they did not leave alphabetic inscriptions on their temples explaining each feature in the way ancient Egyptians sometimes carved texts into walls. There is no carved paragraph at Yurac Rumi saying, "On the third morning after the rains, pour the offering here while facing that ridge," which is inconsiderate from a modern research perspective, but quite normal from the point of view of a culture that transmitted meaning through practice, memory and place. When Spanish chroniclers described Inca and Andean religious practices, they preserved valuable information, but they also brought their own assumptions, fears and goals. Many were not neutral observers. Missionaries saw idolatry where local people saw sacred relationship. Colonial officials saw political danger where communities saw continuity. Translators had to carry Quechua concepts into Spanish religious language, and some ideas did not travel cleanly. A huaca might become an idol in a colonial account, but that word shrinks the concept. It turns a living sacred place into something like a false statue. In that act of translation, much is lost. So when we try to understand Yurac Rumi through colonial records, we are often looking through a window that is useful, cracked, and slightly dusty all at once. It lets in light, but it also distorts the view. This is one of the things Yurac Rumi refuses to tell us directly. How it was understood by the people who loved, feared, maintained, or served it. We can reconstruct patterns from Andean religion, but we cannot fully recover the local language of feeling. Was the White Rock approached with awe, with obligation, with gratitude, with fear? Did common people see it often, or only from a distance? Did attendants live nearby and care for it as part of their daily work? Did the Inca ruler visit it personally during important ceremonies? Were offerings made for water, fertility, royal health, military success, ancestral connection, or all of these at different times? The stone gives hints, it does not give diaries. Even the name Yurac Rumi White Rock tells us only so much. It names a visible quality, and perhaps that quality mattered. A pale stone in a green valley catches the eye. It stands apart from darker earth, vegetation, and shadow. In ritual settings, visible distinction often matters. But did the whiteness carry a deeper symbolic meaning at this site? Was it associated with purity, light, water, ancestry, the sun, or simply the practical fact that everyone could identify easily as the white rock near the spring? We cannot be sure. Names can be ancient, or they can be later. They can preserve meaning, simplify it, or shift over time. A name is a clue, not a conclusion. It is a finger pointing at the stone, not the whole hand that shaped it. The exact age of the shrine's carved features is another area where certainty softens. The site is strongly associated with the Inca presence in Vilcabamba, especially the late Inca world around Vitcos, but sacred places can have earlier lives. A spring may have mattered long before a state decided to formalize it. A natural outcrop may have been known locally, before Inca specialists cut its surfaces into the form we now see. The Inca were not always creators from nothing. Often, like many empires, they recognized places that already held significance and brought them into a larger political and sacred system. Yurac Rumi may have been an Inca creation in its surviving carved form, but perhaps the place itself had older roots. The stone does not tell us when people first looked at it and decided it mattered. It only tells us that at some point, mattering became strong enough to leave marks. There is also the question of whether the shrine was finished. This may sound odd because ruins are often described as though they reached one final perfect form and then history damaged them. But sacred sites can grow, change, and be reworked. A ledge might be added after a new ritual need appears. A channel might be deepened after repeated use. A surface might be smoothed during one ruler's time and another area shaped later. Damage from Spanish attack or weathering may have altered the original arrangement. Some features we see may be incomplete, repaired, eroded, or modified. We tend to look for a single design, a final plan, because that is comforting. But Yurac Rumi may have had a biography rather than a blueprint. And biographies, as anyone with old family stories knows, rarely fit neatly onto one page. The stone also refuses to tell us how much of its meaning was local and how much was imperial. This is a subtle but important question. The Inca Empire was vast, but it worked through local relationships. Cusco's rulers brought state rituals, royal ideology, and administrative control into many regions, but they also incorporated local sacred places and traditions. Vilcabamba itself, though closely tied to the final Inca rulers, was still a lived landscape with its own communities and histories. Was Yurac Rumi primarily a royal shrine, centred on the Inca court at nearby Vitcos? Was it a local sacred place adopted and reshaped by Inca authority? Was it both, with local and royal meanings layered together? The answer matters, but the stone does not divide its surfaces into labelled sections. Local belief here, imperial politics there, mixed meaning in the middle. It simply holds the layers together, which is what places tend to do. This layering may explain why the shrine feels so dense. If it served only one purpose, we might expect a simpler form. But if it connected local water sources, mountain powers, Inca rulership, royal exile, resistance, seasonal ritual, and colonial conflict, then its complexity becomes more understandable. It is not one mystery. It is several histories occupying the same stone. This is why single-answer theories often feel unsatisfying. To say it was a water shrine may be true, but incomplete. To say it was a royal ceremonial site may be true, but incomplete. To say it was an astronomical marker might be possible in some limited sense, but unless supported carefully, it risks becoming too narrow. Yurac Rumi does not seem interested in being reduced. It has had centuries to practice being difficult. The possibility of astronomical meaning is one of those areas where caution is especially useful. The Inca certainly observed the sun, tracked seasonal cycles, and built sites where light and shadow mattered. They were deeply attentive to the sky, but modern people are sometimes too eager to turn every ancient angle into an alignment. Give us a notch, a shadow, and a sunrise, and before long someone is whispering about cosmic calculators. At Yurac Rumi, the relationship between sunlight and carved surfaces may have mattered, but identifying precise alignments requires careful study. Measurements, horizon observations, seasonal testing, and comparison with known Inca practices. Without that, we can say the sun was likely important in the cultural world around the shrine. We should be slower to say that a specific groove proves a specific date. The stone may have marked time, or it may simply have worked with light in a more general ritual sense. Sometimes a sunbeam is a calendar. Sometimes it is just a sunbeam behaving beautifully. Water is clearer, but still not fully transparent. The spring and carved channels invite interpretation, yet they do not reveal the exact liquids or rituals involved. Water from the spring may have been central. Chicha, the fermented maize drink used in many Andean ceremonies, may have been poured as an offering. Other substances could have been involved. The movement of liquid might have symbolized fertility, communication with the earth, royal blessing, purification, or a return of life-giving fluid to the land. The channels may have guided offerings in a controlled sequence, or some may have served drainage functions later interpreted ritually. The truth may include both. Practical drainage and sacred flow can share the same path, rather like a person trying to be deeply spiritual while also making sure the roof does not leak. One of the most haunting things Yurac Rumi refuses to tell us is the soundscape of the place. Ruins are quiet now, but ceremonies are rarely silent. There may have been speech, chanting, singing, flute music, drums, the murmur of gathered people, the splash of water, the movement of sandals on stone, the rustle of textiles, the breath of llamas nearby, the wind in the valley, and perhaps the low everyday noises of attendants preparing what needed to be prepared. A sacred place is not only visual, it is heard, smelled, touched, and felt through the body. Smoke from offerings may have drifted through the air. Wet stone may have had a particular scent after rain or ritual pouring. The spring may have sounded louder at certain seasons. None of this survives in the carved surface, and yet without it our picture is incomplete. We see the instrument, we do not hear the music. The people are missing most of all. Archaeology often leaves us with stone and asks us to imagine lives around it. Who woke before dawn to prepare the shrine? Who carried vessels to the spring? Who cleaned the channels after leaves and sediment gathered? Who taught the proper gestures to someone younger? Who watched from a distance knowing the meaning but not permitted to approach? Who feared that Spanish missionaries might damage the place? Who felt anger when they did? Who returned after the old court was gone and found the stone still there but the world changed around it? Yurac Rumi refuses to give us their faces. It keeps their names mostly out of reach. But the stone's existence proves that they were there, because sacred places do not maintain themselves. Even stone needs people to become a shrine. This absence should make us careful with our own imagination. It is tempting to fill the missing human story with whatever feels dramatic. We could imagine secret priests, forbidden ceremonies, hidden royal treasures, or ancient technologies lost to time. Some of these ideas make exciting stories, but they may tell us more about modern appetites than Inca reality. The harder and better task is to imagine ordinary devotion and organised ritual. People doing what their society taught them mattered. People maintaining relationships with water, stone, ancestors, mountains and rulers. People under pressure from conquest trying to preserve continuity. That story may be less flashy than hidden machines, but it's far more powerful because it is human. Yurac Rumi also refuses to tell us exactly how it felt to witness the end of its world. Of course, stones do not witness in the human sense. They do not feel grief, confusion or fear. But they remain where human grief, confusion and fear took place. After the Spanish campaign ended independent Inca rule in Vilcabamba, the shrine lost the political world that had made it central. The last ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed in Cusco. The court dissolved, settlements shifted, ritual specialists lost protection or were forced into new religious arrangements. The White Rock remained in its valley, but the social body around it had been broken. We can describe these events historically, but we cannot know the full emotional weight carried by the people who lived through them. The stone refuses sentimentality, but it does not prevent us from understanding that something profound was lost. There is another kind of refusal too, the refusal to fit modern expectations of mystery. Many people approach places like Yurac Rumi hoping for a revelation that overturns everything. They want the stone to confess that archaeologists are wrong, that history is hiding a secret, that one unusual feature will unravel the past. But Yurac Rumi does not need to overturn history to be astonishing. Its real mystery is not that it is impossible. Its real mystery is that it is embedded in a worldview we can only partially reconstruct. That is a quieter mystery, but a deeper one. It asks for patience rather than shock. It asks us to accept complexity, which is a terrible inconvenience for anyone trying to make a 10-second explanation, but very good for a sleepy journey through ancient Peru. The difference matters because false mysteries often push aside real people. When we say ancient monuments must have been made by some unknown superior force because they seem too impressive, we accidentally take achievement away from the cultures who actually made them. We make the Inca less capable in order to make the object more exciting. But Yurac Rumi becomes more exciting, not less, when we give the Inca their full intelligence. The question is not, who else could have done this? The question is, what did this mean to the people who did? That question leads us into history, religion, craft, landscape, politics, and memory. It gives us a stone richer than any fantasy machine. And still, a responsible answer does not make the stone ordinary. There are details that remain genuinely puzzling. Some carved forms do not have obvious functions. Some relationships between surfaces are difficult to read. The full ritual sequence is unknown. The degree of damage from colonial attacks and later erosion complicates interpretation. The relationship between Yurac Rumi and nearby structures is still open to study. The possibility of alignments with landscape features deserves careful measurement. The shrine's development over time may be more complicated than a single Inca period construction. These are real uncertainties. They should not be hidden. In fact, they are part of why the site deserves attention. Archaeology is not a machine that turns ruins into certainty. It is a method for asking better questions from incomplete evidence. There is comfort in that, strangely enough. We live in a world that often demands instant answers, confident statements, and neat explanations. Yurac Rumi offers something slower. It says, here is what can be known. Here is what can be inferred. Here is what remains uncertain. It reminds us that not every silence is a failure. Some silences are the shape of time. The people who made and used the White Rock did not plan for every future question. They lived in their own present, with their own needs, fears, obligations, and ceremonies. The fact that we cannot fully enter that present is not surprising. It is what makes the past. And perhaps this is why ancient places can feel so moving. They are both close and unreachable. You can stand before the same stone. You can see the same valley. You can hear water from the same spring, or at least from the same source continuing its patient work. You can feel sunlight on your face, just as someone did centuries ago. And yet, the meaning that once surrounded those sensations has changed. The ritual words are gone. The royal court is gone. The people who knew exactly where to stand and what to pour are gone. The stone remains as a bridge that does not quite reach the other side. It carries us part way, and then asks us to pause. That pause is valuable. It prevents us from treating the past as something we own. Yurac Rumi is not ours to solve completely. It belongs first to the Andean world that made it, to the communities whose ancestors lived with such places, and to the landscape that still holds it. Our role is not to seize its meaning, but to approach it carefully, to learn enough to avoid nonsense, to remain humble enough to avoid false certainty, to let the stone be both understandable and mysterious. That balance is not weakness, it is respect. One of the most important things Yurac Rumi still refuses to tell us is whether we are asking the right questions at all. We ask what it was for because function matters to us, but perhaps the better question is what relationships it maintained. We ask how it was carved because tools fascinate us, but perhaps the better question is why labour was organised around this rock and spring. We ask whether it aligns with the sun because alignments feel precise, but perhaps the better question is how light, water, and movement made the shrine active during lived ceremonies. We ask why it does not make sense, but perhaps the better question is what kind of sense we are expecting. A stone made within a sacred Andean landscape may never make sense if we ask it to behave like a modern object, and yet it makes enough sense to keep drawing us back. It makes sense as a worked huaca. It makes sense as part of Vilcabamba's sacred geography. It makes sense as a place where water, stone, and royal authority may have met. It makes sense as something missionaries wanted to suppress because it carried power. It makes sense as a survivor whose form still preserves traces of actions we can no longer see. What it refuses is the final sentence. It refuses to be reduced to one caption, one theory, one secret, one dramatic reveal. Like many old places, it is not hiding a single answer in the back. It is holding a history too layered for one answer to contain. So we return once more to the image of the White Rock in its valley. The spring still nearby, the carved channels waiting in the stone, the ledges and plains catching light differently as the day moves, the ruins of Vitcos not far away, recalling rulers who tried to preserve an empire's last authority in the mountains, the colonial violence that damaged sacred relationships but did not erase every trace, the later visitors who came with notebooks, cameras, theories, doubts and wonder. Through all of them, Yurac Rumi remains difficult in the best possible way. It does not confuse because it is meaningless. It confuses because it once meant more than we can recover. And maybe that is why the stone feels so appropriate for a quiet night of thinking. It does not demand that we solve it before sleep. It invites us to rest beside the unanswered parts. There is something gentle in admitting that an ancient place can be partly known and partly beyond us. The mind does not always need a locked door to open. Sometimes it needs a threshold to sit beside for a while, listening to water in the dark. Yurac Rumi gives us that threshold. A carved rock, a sacred spring, a vanished court, a damaged shrine, a surviving form. It stands between explanation and wonder, between what archaeology can say and what history has carried away. And as the valley grows quiet again in the imagination, the White Rock does not become less mysterious. It becomes more real, because the mystery now belongs not to fantasy, but to the long human story beneath it. The story that waits under the Andes with stone for bones, water for breath, and memory folded into every surface that still remains. Beneath the Andes, mystery does not always announce itself loudly. It does not need thunder, hidden doors, or a dramatic voice whispering that everything we know is wrong. Sometimes it rests in a valley beside running water, pale against the earth, shaped by hands that are gone and held in place by mountains that have seen too much to hurry. Yurac Rumi is that kind of mystery. Not the sort that leaps out from behind history wearing a cloak and demanding applause, but the quieter sort. The sort that remains after careful explanations have been given, after the wild claims have been set aside, after the stone has been placed back into its real world of Inca rulership, sacred springs, carved surfaces, and the long shadow of conquest. It is not mysterious because nobody could have made it. It is mysterious because people did make it, and we can no longer fully stand inside the meaning they gave it. That is a different feeling, and perhaps a better one. It asks less of our shock and more of our attention. A false mystery tries to make the past seem impossible. A real mystery makes the past seem deep. Yurac Rumi belongs to the second kind. We can see the intelligence in it. We can see that the stone was chosen, shaped, and used with purpose. We can see its relationship to the spring, to Vitcos, to Vilcabamba, to the last Inca rulers who held their fragile independence in the mountains after Cusco had fallen. We can see enough to know that this place mattered, and yet we cannot see everything. The exact rituals are gone, the voices are gone, the gestures are gone. The people who knew why one ledge mattered more than another have left no simple explanation behind. The stone remains like a sentence whose language we partly understand, with some of its most important words softened by time. This is one of the reasons ancient places stay with us. They are not only windows into what human beings once did, they are reminders of how much human life disappears. Most of what matters to us day by day leaves very little trace. A conversation with a friend, a worried evening, a meal shared after difficult news, a joke told at exactly the wrong moment and somehow making everything better. A ceremony performed because the ancestors required it, a prayer said quietly beside water. These things can shape lives, families and kingdoms, but they do not always become durable. Stone survives better than breath. So when we look at Yurac Rumi, we are looking at the hard remainder of a soft world. The rock is still here, the people are not. And between those two facts, the mystery opens. It is tempting to imagine the shrine in its active life, before abandonment and damage and rediscovery turned it into an archaeological question. The valley is not empty. People are moving through it. Some have come from nearby buildings, some from paths that wind through the mountains. The spring is flowing, as it always has, doing its patient work without asking permission from kings or priests. The carved surfaces are not just interesting shapes. They are known surfaces, used surfaces, places where hands have gone before. Someone understands the order of things. Someone knows where the offering is placed. Someone knows who may approach and who must stand back. Someone knows which words belong to the moment. The rock is not a puzzle then. It is part of a living practice. Perhaps water is poured. Perhaps chicha darkens the pale stone as it follows a channel. Perhaps sunlight catches the wet surface and makes it briefly brighter. Perhaps a ruler, priest, attendant or noble stands where others can see. Perhaps the ceremony links the court at Vilcabamba to the land itself, reminding everyone that Inca authority has not vanished simply because Cusco is occupied. The mountains still stand, the spring still gives, the sun still moves across the sky. The old order is wounded, but here for a time it continues. We do not know the exact scene. We should not pretend that we do. But the stone asks us to imagine enough to remember that sacred places were not built for photographs. They were built for presence, and then history presses in. The Spanish conquest was not only a military and political transformation, it was a struggle over meaning. It was about who could name the world, who could define what was sacred, who could decide which rituals were lawful and which were forbidden. A place like Yurac Rumi was not a harmless curiosity in that struggle. It was a rival centre of meaning. A sacred rock beside a spring may not look threatening to a modern tourist with a water bottle and sensible shoes, but to missionaries trying to uproot Andean religion, it represented continuity. It showed that people still returned to older relationships. It showed that the land itself still held memory. That is why such places were attacked. Not because stones are dangerous by themselves, but because people gathered around them and made them powerful. There is sadness in that, but also endurance. The Vilcabamba state ended. Tupac Amaru, the last independent Inca ruler, was captured and executed. The royal court dissolved. Missionaries, officials, soldiers, and new systems of colonial control reshaped the region. The ceremonies at Yurac Rumi did not continue as they once had. Yet the stone did not vanish. The spring did not forget its root. The valley did not become blank. Even damaged, even misunderstood, even separated from the rituals that once gave it full life, Yurac Rumi remained. It waited beneath the Andes, not asleep exactly, but quieter, holding the form of a world that could no longer speak in the same way. When modern eyes returned to it, they brought new questions. Some were careful, some were impatient. Some looked at the stone and saw archaeology, others saw mystery, and others saw a convenient opportunity for very dramatic claims indeed. That is also part of the stone's afterlife. Ancient monuments do not stop changing meaning after their original use ends. They become ruins, then evidence, then heritage, then tourist destinations, then internet mysteries, then bedtime topics for people who really did intend to sleep earlier, but are now learning about Inca sacred geography at 1:17 in the morning. This is not necessarily a bad fate. Curiosity keeps old places present. But curiosity needs care, especially when the place belongs to real histories and living descendants, rather than to the vague fog of ancient secrets. Yurac Rumi deserves that care. It deserves to be seen not as an impossible object, but as an Andean one. It belongs to a tradition of working with stone, not against it. It belongs to a landscape where mountains, springs, rocks, ancestors, rulers, and communities were tied together through ritual and obligation. It belongs to the difficult final decades of Inca independence, when Vilcabamba was both refuge and kingdom. It belongs to a world where a carved rock could be a sacred presence, a political statement, a ceremonial surface, and a point of contact with the living land. That is more interesting than any lazy explanation that takes credit away from the people who made it. The true wonder is not that Yurac Rumi lies beyond human ability. The true wonder is that human ability, guided by belief and necessity, could make a place like this. And yet, even when we honour that human ability, the mystery remains. Not every question can be answered by respect alone. We still do not know every ritual sequence. We still do not know whether certain surfaces held specific symbolic meanings that are now lost. We still do not know how the shrine may have changed over time. We still do not know how much of its sacred importance came from older local traditions and how much from Inca royal use. We still do not know what the people of Vilcabamba felt when the shrine was damaged or when the final Inca state fell. Archaeology can guide us to the edge of these questions, but it cannot always carry us across. The past has boundaries, and sometimes the most honest scholarship is the one that says, here is what we know, here is what we suspect, and here is where the stone keeps its silence. There is a kind of peace in that silence, if we do not fight it too hard. The modern world often treats uncertainty as a problem to be eliminated. We want every answer clear, every object labelled, every mystery resolved in one neat explanation before the next notification arrives. But old places move at a different speed. Yurac Rumi has had centuries to become comfortable with unanswered questions. It does not mind if we do not solve it tonight. It has waited through empire, conquest, weather, neglect, rediscovery, and debate. It can certainly wait through one more human mind turning over possibilities in the dark. Perhaps that is why it suits a sleep journey so well. Not because it is dull, because it certainly is not, but because it invites a slower kind of thinking. It lets us wander without demanding that we arrive at a final gate. We can picture the valley, the pale rock, the carved channels, the water moving quietly, the mountains rising around it. We can think about the hands that shaped it, the people who approached it, the rulers who may have used it to keep authority alive in a broken world. We can think about the missionaries who feared it, the centuries that softened it, and the visitors who still stand before it wondering what they are seeing. And then we can let the mystery remain where it belongs, not as a failure, but as part of the stone's truth. Because some mysteries are not locked rooms, they are landscapes. You do not open them once and finish, you return to them. You notice a different line in the stone, a different relationship with the water, a different historical pressure behind the carving. You learn a little more and the place becomes clearer but also larger. That is what Yurac Rumi does. It begins as an odd carved rock in Peru that does not seem to make sense. Then it becomes a sacred stone beside a spring. Then it becomes part of Vilcabamba. Then part of the final Inca resistance. Then part of a larger Andean understanding of landscape, water, authority and memory. The more context we give it, the less isolated it becomes. And the less isolated it becomes, the more meaningful its strangeness feels. So perhaps the title itself, this Peruvian megalith, does not make sense, is both true and not true. It does not make sense if we ask it to behave like a modern object with one function, one label, and one answer. It does not make sense if we expect sacred geometry to explain itself like a user manual. It does not make sense if we separate the stone from the spring from the valley from Vilcabamba, and Vilcabamba from the last Inca rulers who fought to preserve a world under pressure. But once those connections are restored, even partly, Yurac Rumi begins to make a different kind of sense. Not simple sense, not complete sense, but human sense, historical sense, sacred sense. The sort of sense that belongs to a world where stone could be alive with relationship, water could carry offering, and a valley could hold the last echoes of an empire refusing to disappear quietly. And now, after all this wandering, we come back to where we began, a pale stone in the Andes, waiting. We have moved around it slowly. We have looked at its carved surfaces, its spring, its possible rituals, its place near Vitcos, its ties to the lost Inca world of Vilcabamba. We have considered the hands that shaped it and the forces that animated it. Sunlight, water, memory, power, and the human need to make meaning endure. We have seen that the stone is not evidence of impossibility, but evidence of a culture whose relationship with landscape was more layered than our quick categories can hold. And still, Yurac Rumi remains partly hidden in plain sight. That is its gift and its challenge. So let me ask you once more, gently, wherever you're listening from tonight. Is there a place near you that feels older than its explanation? An old wall with no plaque? A hill with a strange name? A church built on earlier stones? A spring in the woods? A path that seems to remember more footsteps than anyone can count? Human beings have always left meaning in places. Sometimes we write it in books. Sometimes we carve it into rock. Sometimes we simply return to the same spot again and again until the place begins to hold us too. Yurac Rumi is far away for many of us, high in the Peruvian Andes, but the feeling it gives is not entirely distant. It is the feeling of standing before something made by people who are gone and realizing that they were as serious, as skilled, as hopeful, as afraid, and as devoted as we are. If this quiet journey through the white rock and the lost valleys of Vilcabamba has brought you a little curiosity, a little calm, or simply a softer place for your thoughts to rest, I would be ever so grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, or shared it with someone who enjoys wandering gently through the deep places of Earth. It helps this calm corner reach other travellers of history, science, and sleep. The sort of people who can spend a peaceful evening thinking about ancient stone channels and still call it relaxation, which is honestly a rather admirable talent. For now, though, the valley grows dim in the imagination. The sun lowers behind the ridges. The carved surfaces lose their sharpness. The spring keeps moving in the dark because water has never needed an audience. The mountains settle into shadow, carrying the old Inca roads, the ruins of Vitcos, the memory of Vilcabamba, and the pale stone that still waits beneath them. Yurac Rumi does not give us everything. It does not need to. It gives us enough to remember that the past is not a solved thing, but a living distance, something we approach with care, humility, and wonder. And somewhere in the Andes, beneath cloud and starlight, the white rock remains, holding its unanswered questions quietly while the night gathers around it. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are, and may your dreams move gently tonight through valleys of stone, water, and ancient mountain silence.